The soldier did not finish the word he was speaking. He had been turning the corner of Miła Street with 3 others, his rifle slung loose, his breath visible in the January air, saying something to the man behind him, the end of a sentence that no one in Warsaw would ever hear. Then a window opened above him, and the world that had existed 1 second earlier stopped existing. The shot came from the 4th floor. It was a single pistol round, fired by a hand that had never held a pistol before that morning. The soldier fell sideways into the snow, and the snow was already grey from ash and from the boots of men who had walked through this district for weeks without resistance. The other 3 Germans dropped behind a wall. One of them shouted. No one answered from the building. For a long moment, longer than it should have been, nothing else happened. The street simply held the body. A scrap of paper drifted from somewhere higher up, caught the wind, and landed near the soldier's open hand. Behind the wall, the surviving Germans were waiting for orders that no one had prepared them to give. They had not been told this was possible. It was the 18th of January, 1943. It was the morning the Germans returned to the Warsaw Ghetto to take what they believed was already theirs. They had come for 8,000 people, a number written in a folder, a number that already had trains assigned to it. The trains were waiting at the Umschlagplatz 2 blocks away, breathing steam into the cold. Everything had been arranged. What had not been arranged was the window on the 4th floor. To understand what was about to happen, one would have to walk backward through the months that had come before, and that walk is not gentle. 6 months earlier, in July of 1942, this district had held more than 350,000 Jews. By the time the snow began to fall, fewer than 60,000 remained. The rest had left in trains. No one came back. No letters arrived. The silence from the east was the loudest thing inside the ghetto walls. Those who remained had stopped using the word deportation. They had stopped using most words. What replaced speech was a kind of attention, a way of listening to footsteps in stairwells, to the pause before a door was knocked, to the engines of trucks at 4 in the morning. The body learned things the mind refused to name. And just beyond the wall, perhaps 30 meters from where the German soldier now lay in the snow, a tram was passing. Line 17, half empty in the cold, carrying Polish workers from Żoliborz toward the center of the city. The driver did not slow down. The passengers did not turn their heads. The bell rang once at the corner, mechanical and indifferent, and the sound carried over the wall the way it always had, a small fragment of an ordinary morning, delivered to people who had not seen an ordinary morning in 2 years. Inside a building, 3 streets away, a young man was being told what had just happened. He was 23 years old. He was thin in the way that everyone in the ghetto was thin by then, but there was something in his shoulders that did not match the thinness, something that had been gathering quietly for months. He listened to the messenger without interrupting. He asked one question. He did not ask whether the soldier was dead. He asked how many bullets remained. His name does not need to be spoken yet. There will be time. What matters in this moment is the silence after his question, and the way the messenger answered without lifting his eyes. What matters is that somewhere in the building, beneath the floorboards of a room that had once held a tailor's workshop, there were 11 other pistols. 11. For 60,000 people. Outside, the Germans had recovered. They had pulled back 2 blocks and were calling for reinforcements. A radio crackled in a half-track parked near the gate. Someone in the chain of command, sitting in a warm office in another part of the city, was being informed that the operation had encountered, in the careful language of military reports, an unexpected element. The phrase would be revised later. First it would be softened. Then it would be erased. But on Miła Street, the body of the soldier was still in the snow. No one had come to move it. The other Germans were not looking at it any longer. They were looking up, at the windows, at the rooftops, at the small dark openings that had always been there, but had never, until that morning, meant what they meant now. Somewhere a door closed quietly. Somewhere a child was being told to be still. Somewhere the tram bell rang again, faint and far, and a passenger glanced toward the wall without seeing it. The shot had been fired. No one yet knew what it meant. Not the man who had pulled the trigger. Not the messenger. Not the young man counting bullets in a back room. Not the German officers waiting for reinforcements. Not the historians who would, decades later, write the first sentence of a chapter about this morning and discover that the first sentence is the hardest one to write. What was certain, what could already be felt by anyone who knew how to listen, was that something had been taken back. Something small. Something irreversible. And the snow kept falling on the body in the street, covering it slowly, as if the city itself were trying to decide whether to remember. By the second day, the Germans had stopped entering certain streets. They did not announce this. They simply rerouted. A patrol that had been ordered to sweep Zamenhofer Street between 8 and 10 in the morning passed instead through Smoksha, then doubled back along Glacier, taking a longer path that avoided 3 specific intersections. The men did not discuss why. The officer at the front of the column did not explain. They walked faster than they had walked the day before, and they kept their rifles in their hands instead of slung across their backs. This was the shape of what had changed. Not a battle. Not yet. A small adjustment in the geometry of how an army moved through a city, and in that adjustment, a confession. Inside the ghetto, no one celebrated. The few people who had heard about the events on Miła Street the previous morning passed the news the way people pass news of a death, quietly, with hands held still, with the understanding that what had happened would be paid for. Some of them did not believe it at first. A German soldier shot dead by a Jew in the street, in daylight, with the body left where it fell. This was a thing that did not happen. It belonged to a category of events that the world had spent the last 2 years proving impossible. And yet the body had been there, and the patrol the next morning had walked around it. In Kraków, in a building requisitioned 3 years earlier for the offices of the SS and police leader for the general government, a telegram was being read for the second time. The man reading it was tall and grey, and he held the paper at a slight distance from his face, the way men of a certain age and rank had begun to do. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Kruger. He had spent the morning preparing for a meeting about agricultural quotas in the Lublin district. He had not been expecting the telegram. The telegram did not use the word resistance. It used the word incident. Then further down, the word complications. Kruger read it twice, and then placed it on the desk and sat for a moment without speaking. Outside the window of his office, snow was falling on the courtyards of a city that had once belonged to other people. He could hear faintly the bells of a church he did not attend. What troubled him was not the dead soldier. Soldiers died. What troubled him was the pause that would now have to be inserted into a sentence, the sentence he would soon have to compose, the sentence that began with the words, "The action proceeded as planned." That sentence had been written hundreds of times in the last 6 months, attached to hundreds of similar telegrams from hundreds of similar mornings. And now, for the first time, the sentence required a footnote. Kruger did not yet know that the footnote would grow. 3 streets away from where the soldier had fallen, in a basement that had once stored coal for a tenement now half empty, a meeting was being held by candlelight. There were perhaps 11 people in the room. The youngest was 17. The oldest was 31. They sat on overturned crates and on the floor, and the air smelled of damp brick and of the particular tiredness that comes from sleeping in clothes for many nights. The young man at the center of the room, the one who had asked, the day before, how many bullets remained, was speaking quietly. He had a way of speaking that made people lean forward without knowing they had leaned. He was saying that what had happened on Miła Street was not a victory. He was saying that the Germans would return, and that when they returned, they would not return the same way. He was saying that the time for hiding was ending, and that the time for something else was beginning, and that no one in the room should mistake the second thing for hope. Then he said the word bunker. He said it the way another man might have said the word grave. The order was simple. Every building still inhabited by Jews, every cellar, every attic, every space behind a false wall, was to be prepared. Tunnels were to be dug between adjacent basements. Air shafts were to be hidden in chimneys. Water was to be stored in any vessel that could hold it. The work was to begin that night and to continue without pause until the Germans came again. No one in the room asked when that would be. They had all stopped asking questions whose answers they did not want. The young man finished speaking. No one applauded. No one spoke. Someone passed a cigarette around the circle, and each person took the smallest possible draw before passing it on. The candle on the floor between them flickered once, sharply, and then steadied. Above them, through the floorboards, through the walls, through the cold streets and across the wall that divided the ghetto from the rest of the city, the tram on line 17 was passing again. It was the last tram of the evening. A few passengers, returning home from late shifts, sat with their hands in their coats and their faces turned toward windows that showed them nothing but their own reflections. One of them was reading a newspaper. The newspaper carried no mention of what had happened on Miła Street. No newspaper would. The tram bell rang once at the corner of Bonifraterska, and the sound entered the ghetto the way sound always entered, without permission, without weight, without any awareness on the part of those who had produced it that they had produced anything at all. In the basement, the young man was rolling out a map. It was hand-drawn, in pencil, on the back of a school exercise sheet. It showed the streets of the ghetto reduced to their essential geometry, with small marks at certain intersections and small numbers in certain squares. The numbers were not addresses. They were depths. By morning, in 3 separate cellars, men were already digging. And in Krakow, Kruger was composing his telegram. Both groups believed they were preparing for the same thing. Neither was correct. The pickaxe struck brick, and the brick gave way, and the man holding the pickaxe stopped to listen before lifting it again. He was 42 years old. He had been a watchmaker before the war. His hands, which had spent 20 years adjusting mechanisms smaller than a fingernail, were now learning a different precision. How to break a wall without making the sound of breaking a wall. He worked in the darkness of a cellar that had once held barrels of pickled cabbage, and the air around him smelled of old vinegar and of the dust that came loose with each strike. Above him, through 3 floors of tenement, an old woman was coughing. She had been coughing for 2 weeks. The watchmaker had learned to time his pickaxe to her cough, striking at the moment her body produced its own sound, so that the wall came apart in fragments hidden inside the rhythm of her dying. This was the work of February. It was the work of March. It would continue in cellars and subcellars and in the spaces beneath floors until the ghetto became a city with two cities inside it, the visible one above, slowly emptying, and the invisible one below, slowly being built. No one had ordered this work in the way that orders were given in armies. There was no central plan, no engineer drawing schematics in a clean room. There was a network of men and women, scattered across the remaining buildings, who had received a single instruction from the meeting in the basement on the second night: dig, connect, hide, prepare, and who had translated that instruction into the only language they had, which was the language of their own hands and their own walls and their own particular knowledge of where things could be hidden. A baker discovered that the oven in his shop, if removed entirely, opened into a chimney shaft wide enough for a man to descend. He removed the oven. The shaft now led to a chamber his grandfather had used generations ago to store flour during the cholera years. The chamber held 40 people if they sat without moving. A printer found that the floor beneath his press, lifted carefully, revealed a void left by builders who had cut corners in 1908. The void could be enlarged. He enlarged it. A woman who had run a small school for girls before the war began removing the back wall of her classroom storeroom, brick by brick, by the light of a single candle, working between 2 and 4 in the morning. Her husband had been taken in August. Her son had been taken in September. She had not spoken aloud since October. She broke the wall in silence, and she rebuilt it in silence, and the bricks she removed she carried, one by one, in a coal scuttle, to a courtyard where another woman waited to take them away. None of these people knew each other by name. They knew the work. The work was enough. And while the cellars opened, and the tunnels grew, and the false walls multiplied, another thing was happening, something that on paper looked like commerce, and in practice looked like miracle. Pistols were entering the ghetto. They came in coal sacks. They came inside loaves of bread baked twice. They came strapped to the inner thigh of a 14-year-old girl who crossed the wall through a sewer grate and returned the same way before dawn. They came from the Polish underground, the Home Army, the People's Guard, sometimes given freely, more often sold. The price was not measured in money. A pistol cost a gold ring, or a watch, or a fur coat that had once belonged to a woman who no longer needed warmth. A grenade cost more. A rifle, when one could be found, cost everything a family had left. The young man who had spoken in the basement on the second night did not handle these transactions himself. He had become, over the weeks, something between a commander and a ghost, present at certain meetings, absent from others, sleeping in a different building each night, never twice in the same bed. The few who saw him said he had grown thinner. The few who heard him said he had grown quieter. His name by then was being spoken in 3 or 4 cellars at once, always softly, always with the small hesitation that names acquire when their owners might not survive long enough to keep them. Mordecai Anielewicz, 23 years old, commander of the Jewish Combat Organization, a title he had not asked for, and which described an organization that, by any military measure, did not exist. On a night in late March, in a room above a bakery on Miła Street, he met with a woman called Zivia. She had crossed the wall earlier that evening, and she carried, beneath her coat, a list: names, contacts, 3 additional pistols, and a single piece of news from the Polish side. She placed all of it on the table without speaking, and waited for him to look up. The news was that the Germans had begun moving additional forces into the suburbs. Not many, Not yet. But the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had watched armies prepare. They were assembling for a return. Mordecai read the list. He read the news. He folded both pieces of paper and placed them inside the lining of his jacket, in a pocket that did not exist when the jacket had been made. Then he looked at Zivia, and he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life, which would be longer than his by 45 years. He did not say they could win. He did not say they could survive. He said only that what mattered now was the manner of dying. He said it the way another man, in another century, might have spoken about the weather, with a kind of practical attention, as if naming a fact that had already settled. Zivia did not answer. There was nothing to answer. She poured a small measure of water from a tin cup into a glass and drank it slowly, and the silence in the room was the silence of two people who had, between them, already accepted what neither had yet said. Outside the window, the wall ran black against the night sky. Beyond the wall, on the Aryan side, the last tram of the evening was crossing Bonifraterska. The bell rang once. Inside the room above the bakery, neither Mordecai nor Zivia turned toward the sound. They had stopped turning toward it some time ago. The work continued through the night. In the watchmaker's cellar, the wall came apart at last, and the opening revealed a passage to the next building. The watchmaker set down his pickaxe and breathed for a long moment in the dark, listening to make sure the old woman 3 floors above was still coughing. She was. She would cough for another 6 days, and then she would stop, and then the watchmaker would dig in silence. By the first week of April, the underground city was almost finished. No one above ground knew its full extent. No one below ground knew either. It existed only as a network of decisions made by people who would never meet, joined by tunnels that none of them had drawn. What they had built, without naming it, was the architecture of a refusal. They knew what would come. They knew it could not be stopped. They had decided, instead, to make it cost something. The cost had not yet been calculated. But the ledger was open. The carousel arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, drawn by 2 horses that were thinner than horses had been before the war. The men who unloaded it worked without hurry. They carried the painted panels first, then the wooden horses with their chipped manes and their eyes of glass, then the central column with its mechanism of gears and pulleys that would, in 3 days' time, turn slowly enough for children to feel they were flying. The carousel was being assembled in Krasinski Square. The square sat directly against the eastern wall of the ghetto. It was the 14th of April, 1943. Easter was on Sunday. The Catholic Easter, which the city would celebrate. The Jewish Passover, which would begin the day after, in cellars and behind false walls, with whatever bread could be found and whatever silence could be maintained. The men assembling the carousel did not look at the wall. The wall was 3 meters high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire, and it ran along the full eastern length of the square. They had been told where to place the carousel, and they had placed it. If anyone had asked them whether they thought about what was on the other side, they would have answered honestly that they had not. Thinking about what was on the other side was not part of the work. By dusk, the structure was nearly complete. The wooden horses stood in their circle, frozen mid-gallop, their painted nostrils flared. A man on a ladder was stringing electric bulbs along the canopy. A woman who lived in a building on the western side of the square was watching from her window, her hands resting on the sill, and she was thinking about whether to bring her granddaughter on Sunday. The granddaughter was 4. She had never seen a carousel. The woman could hear faintly something from the other side of the wall, a sound she could not identify. She closed the window. What she had heard was hammering. Inside the ghetto, 300 meters from where the carousel was being raised, men were finishing the last reinforcements on a bunker beneath a tenement on Miła Street. The address was 18. The number would mean nothing to her. The number would mean nothing to anyone that afternoon who lived on the side of the wall with electric carousels. Mordecai Anilevich descended the cellar steps for the first time. He had been told the bunker was ready. He had come to see for himself. He carried no light. The men who had built the place lit a small oil lamp and held it at chest height as he moved through the chambers, and the shadows behind him slid across walls of brick and packed earth, and he did not speak. The bunker had been carved beneath the existing cellar of the building. It descended in 2 levels. The first level held the command room, a low-ceilinged space, perhaps 4 meters square, with a long table assembled from doors taken from abandoned apartments and benches built from the same wood. A radio sat at one end of the table, draped in a cloth that did not entirely conceal its shape. Maps had been pinned to the walls, hand-drawn, the same kind of maps that had circulated in basements through February and March, but larger now, more detailed, marked with symbols that only the people in this room would understand. The second level was for the others, the fighters who would not have rooms of their own, the civilians who would come down when the time came. It was a long chamber with low platforms along the walls, sleeping shelves, 3 high, like a ship designed never to sail. A narrow passage at the far end led to the kitchen, which was a single iron stove and a row of jars and a barrel of water that someone had labelled, in chalk, with the date it had been filled. Mordecai walked the length of both levels. He counted the entrances, and he counted the air shafts, and he stood for a long moment at the foot of the ladder that led back up to the cellar above. He asked one of the men how many people the bunker could hold. The man said 120. Mordecai asked how many it could hide. The man understood the difference and did not answer immediately. Then he said, fewer. Mordecai nodded once. He climbed the ladder and emerged into the cellar above and walked out into the courtyard, where the air still smelled of the city, of coal smoke and of the river, and he stood for a moment looking up at the strip of sky that the surrounding buildings allowed him to see. The sky was the color of metal. A few stars had begun to show, dim against the cold. From beyond the wall, faint but distinct, he could hear music. The men in Krasinski Square had finished testing the carousel's mechanism. They had set the music going for a few minutes, a wheezing, mechanical waltz, played by a barrel organ built into the central column. The notes drifted across the wall and into the courtyard where Mordecai was standing. He listened until the music stopped. Then he listened to the silence after the music. Then he went back inside. The tram passed at 10 minutes to 8. Line 17, half empty at that hour, carrying a few late passengers home from the center of the city. The driver knew the route by memory. He had been driving it for 19 years. He noticed, as he passed Krasinski Square, that something new had been built there, a structure he did not recognize, half illuminated by a single strung bulb. He thought for a moment that it looked like a fairground ride. Then he turned the corner, and the thought left him. The bell rang once at Bonifraterska. The sound carried. Inside the bunker on Miła Street, beneath the cellar, beneath the courtyard where Mordecai had stood listening to the carousel, the men were turning down the lamps for the night. They would sleep in shifts. 2 would remain awake at all times. 1 at the radio, one at the foot of the ladder. The watchmaker, the man who had broken the wall in February by timing his pickaxe to the cough of a dying woman, had finished his work 2 weeks earlier and had been reassigned. He was now responsible for the maintenance of the bunker's mechanisms. The hinges, the latches, the small wheel that opened the false panel, disguising the entrance. He inspected each of these things every evening before sleep, by the light of the same oil lamp, and he made a small mark in a notebook he kept in his coat pocket. That night, he made his marks and closed the notebook and lay down on his sleeping shelf and stared at the ceiling, which was perhaps 40 centimeters above his face. He thought, for the first time in many weeks, of his shop, of the small bell that had rung when customers entered, of the smell of oil and brass, of a particular pocket watch he had been repairing in the summer of 1939, which he had never finished, and which was still, presumably, sitting on his workbench in a building 2 streets away that had been emptied in August. He wondered who lived there now. He wondered if the watch was still on the bench. He wondered, briefly and without bitterness, what time it would show. Then he closed his eyes. Above him, through the earth and the brick and the floors of the tenement, the city of Warsaw continued its evening. The carousel stood ready in Krasensky Square. The grandmother in the window across the square had decided, finally, that she would bring her granddaughter on Sunday. She would dress her in the blue coat. She would let her ride twice. 3 calendars were ending at the same time. The Catholic week, which would close with chocolate and bells. The Jewish week, which would open with unleavened bread eaten in the dark. And a 3rd calendar, unwritten, kept by neither faith. The one that began the moment the carousel arrived in the square and would end, exactly 5 days later, when the first German tank turned the corner of Miła Street at 6 in the morning. None of those who had set the calendar in motion knew that they had set it. The men who built the carousel had built it. The men who built the bunker had built it. The men who would fire the first shots had not yet decided where they would stand. The wall between them was 3 meters high. The wall between them was nothing. Before we go any further, wherever you are, whatever hour the clock shows on your side of the world, stay a moment. The story is about to enter a night that very few people lived through, and almost no one wrote about until decades later. If you find yourself listening at a strange hour, in a quiet room, in a city that knows nothing of what is being told, then you are exactly where this archive belongs. Tell me, in a comment, where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is. The archive is built, slowly, by everyone who arrives at it. And now we return to Warsaw. To the 18th of April, 1943. To the night before. The order had been signed in Kraków at 11 in the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, it was in Warsaw. By 6 in the evening, the men who would carry it out had been told what it contained. The order said that the ghetto was to be liquidated. The remaining inhabitants were to be removed, and the buildings were to be cleared, and the operation was to be completed in 3 days. 3 days had been chosen because the 20th of April was the Führer's birthday, and the report of completion was to arrive in Berlin as a gift. The man who had selected the date, somewhere in an office in another country, had not visited Warsaw. He had no need to. The man who would now have to deliver the result, however, had a name and a face and a quiet, methodical way of looking at maps. Jürgen Stroop, SS Brigade Führer, 48 years old. He had been transferred to Warsaw 4 days earlier, specifically for this assignment. The previous commander had been dismissed without explanation. Stroop did not ask for an explanation. He understood that the assignment had been given to him because it was thought to require a particular kind of man, and he was that kind of man, and he intended to demonstrate it. By 7 o'clock that evening, Stroop was sitting in the requisitioned office of the Warsaw SS headquarters, reviewing the deployment plan. 2,090 men. Tanks. Half-tracks. Flamethrowers. Artillery pieces small enough to be moved through narrow streets. The numbers were generous for the task, as he understood it. He expected resistance. The previous commander's reports had warned of organized cells, but he expected the resistance to last hours, not days. He had read the demographic figures. He had read the assessments of armament. He believed he understood what awaited him on the other side of the wall. He did not. What he did not understand could not have been written into any report, because no report had the language for it. What he did not understand was that the people inside the wall had stopped, some weeks ago, calculating the odds of their survival. A man who has stopped calculating his survival is not the same kind of opponent as a man who is still calculating it. The first man fights differently. Stroop had never met that kind of opponent. He had never been told they existed. Inside the ghetto, the news of the impending operation had arrived through the same network that had brought the pistols. A Polish railway worker had passed it to a courier. The courier had crossed the wall through a sewer grate at 4 in the afternoon. By 6, the warning was circulating in 3 languages: Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, through the cellars and the bunkers and the upper rooms where the fighters of the Jewish Combat Organization kept their weapons. Mordecai Anielewicz was at the bunker on Miła Street when he received it. He was sitting at the long table, cleaning a pistol that had been brought in 2 days earlier and which had a defect in its firing pin. He listened to the courier without setting down the pistol. When the courier finished, he asked one question. He asked what time in the morning the Germans were expected to enter. The courier said 6. Mordecai nodded once. He went back to cleaning the pistol. He did not call a meeting. The meetings had already happened weeks ago in the basement, in the candlelight, with the cigarette being passed around the circle. Everything that needed to be decided had been decided then. What remained was the carrying out. Across the ghetto, the carrying out began. In a tenement on Zamenhofer, a young woman of 19 sat on a bed she had not slept in for 3 nights and wrote a letter to her mother, who was already dead, and folded the letter and put it inside a book that she then placed back on the shelf, because she did not know what else to do with it. In a kitchen on Glacier, a man fed his 3 children a dinner of boiled potatoes and watched them eat without speaking, and afterwards he held each of them for a longer time than he usually did, and the children, who were 6 and 4 and 2, accepted this without questioning it. In a 4th-floor room on Naleki, an old rabbi opened the prayer book he had carried with him from his synagogue in August, and turned to the evening service and began to read aloud, slowly, the Hebrew letters moving past him like a procession of small dark animals. In the bunker on Miła Street, Mordecai finished the pistol and laid it on the table and sat for a moment with his hands resting on either side of it. He looked briefly the age he was. 23. A young man at a wooden table in a room dug out of the earth, with 12 hours left before something he had been preparing for since January. He stood and walked to the wall and looked at the map. He looked at it for a long time, although he had memorized it weeks ago. The streets of the ghetto traced in pencil. The bunkers marked in red. The lines of likely advance drawn in faint blue. He thought very briefly that the map looked like a small constellation. Then he turned away and went to find Zivia. Above the ghetto, the night was clear. The first stars had become visible some hours earlier, and had now thickened into a sky the color of dark water. The temperature had dropped. Somewhere a dog was barking, in the way that dogs bark on quiet nights when there is nothing to bark at, patiently, regularly, as if marking the seconds. On the Aryan side, the city slept the sleep of the city. In Krasinski Square, the carousel stood silent under a tarp, ready for Sunday. A few late workers walked home along Bonifraterska. The last tram had passed at 11. The tracks along the wall lay empty in the moonlight, faintly silver where the steel had been worn smooth by years of wheels. No one was riding. No one was watching. The silence on the rails was the same silence that had existed in this place before there had been a wall, and that would exist again after the wall was gone, and that did not concern itself with what passed on either side. Inside the ghetto, the watchmaker climbed onto his sleeping shelf for what might be the last time, and lay listening to the breathing of the men around him. He counted. 18 breaths in the chamber. He had counted them before. He counted them again. It was a thing he had begun doing without knowing why, and which he now did each night, like a prayer he did not believe in. The lamp at the end of the chamber burned low. Someone near the kitchen was humming under his breath, a melody the watchmaker recognized but could not place. A wedding song, perhaps, or something his mother had sung. The humming continued for perhaps 3 minutes and then stopped, and the chamber was quiet again, and the watchmaker closed his eyes and did not sleep. In Stroop's office across the city, the deployment maps were rolled up, and the orders for morning were placed in sealed envelopes for the unit commanders. Stroop himself drank a small glass of brandy and went to bed at 11:30. He slept easily. He had always slept easily. It was one of the things he had been told more than once that recommended him. The night moved through its hours. The grandmother in the window above Krasinski Square slept beside her granddaughter, who had asked, before sleep, what color the carousel horses were. The grandmother had said that she would have to wait and see on Sunday. The girl had accepted this. She was 4 years old, and Sunday was a word that meant a long time from now. At 4 in the morning, the first German trucks began to move into position around the perimeter of the ghetto. The engines were quiet. The men inside spoke in low voices when they spoke at all. The operation had begun, although nothing had yet happened. At 5, the ghetto was surrounded. At 5:50, the first soldiers entered through the gate at Naleki. Inside the bunker on Miła Street, in a chamber dug out of the earth, the watchmaker opened his eyes, though he had never closed them in any way that mattered, and listened, and heard nothing yet, and waited. The tank turned the corner of Naleki Street at 6:01. It came slowly, in the way tanks come into narrow streets, its treads grinding against cobblestones that had been laid before any of the men inside it had been born. Behind it walked a column of infantry in 2 files, 60 men, their rifles held at the ready. The officer at the head of the column was 26 years old. He had been told that this would be over by lunch. The street was empty. No movement in any window. No sound from any door. The buildings on either side rose 4 and 5 stories, blank and brick, and the morning light fell on them at a low angle that left the lower floors in shadow. The officer walked beside the tank, with his hand resting on his holster, and he watched the windows above him with the kind of attention that a man pays to a thing he does not yet believe is dangerous. At the second intersection, the tank stopped. The street ahead narrowed. The officer raised his hand. The column halted behind him. For perhaps 4 seconds, nothing moved on Miła Street, except the small white plumes of breath rising from 60 mouths into the cold April air. The first Molotov cocktail came from a window on the 4th floor. It struck the rear of the tank, just above the engine grill, and it broke, and the burning fuel ran down into the housing and found something it could feed on. The tank shuddered. A second bottle came from a window across the street, and a third from somewhere higher, and a fourth from a rooftop 2 buildings away. And within 10 seconds, the tank was burning along its full length, and the column behind it had broken formation and was firing upward at windows from which no faces could be seen. The officer at the head of the column was shouting orders that no one could hear. The tank's hatch opened. A man in coveralls climbed halfway out and was hit by something, a bullet from a window, or a fragment from one of the burning bottles, and fell back inside. The hatch closed. Smoke poured from the engine compartment in a thick black column that rose straight up in the windless morning, visible from half the city. From the windows above, the firing continued. The fighters had been placed there 2 days earlier. They had not slept on the night before. They had eaten almost nothing for 16 hours. What they fired with was not impressive. Pistols mostly, a single rifle, a small store of grenades that had been carried across the wall in the false bottom of a butter churn. But they fired from positions that the Germans had not anticipated, at angles the Germans had not prepared for, and the effect on a column of infantry caught in a narrow street is not a function of firepower. It is a function of where the shots come from and how quickly they come, and whether the men being shot at understood when they entered the street that they could be shot at. The Germans had not understood this. They learnt it now, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, while the tank burned and their officer screamed for a withdrawal that the noise of the burning tank prevented anyone from hearing. By 6:15, the column was retreating. They left the tank. They left 2 dead men in the street. They left a half-track that had been disabled by a grenade thrown from a doorway by a girl of 17, whose name no record would preserve. They withdrew to the gate at Miła and they regrouped, and the officer at the head of the column, who would survive the war, and who would, decades later, refuse to be interviewed about that morning, sat on the ground beside the gate and held his head in his hands for perhaps a full minute before he stood again. Inside the ghetto, the firing stopped. For a moment, the street was silent again. The tank still burned. Black smoke continued to rise. A scrap of paper, dislodged from somewhere by the heat, drifted across the cobblestones and settled near the body of one of the dead Germans. A scrap of paper. The same kind of scrap that had drifted 3 months earlier near the body of the first soldier on Miła Street. The city seemed to be repeating its small details, as if certain images were being kept on file, to be released at the appropriate moments. In the windows above, the fighters did not cheer. They reloaded. They moved to new positions. They had been told to expect a second wave within the hour. They were preparing for it. The young woman who had thrown the grenade from the doorway was now crouched in a stairwell 2 buildings away, and her hands were shaking, and she did not know whether the shaking was from cold or from something else, and she did not stop to wonder. She had been given 2 more grenades that morning. She had used one. She had 1 remaining. She held it in both hands and waited for the next sound of boots on cobblestones. In the bunker on Miła Street, Mordecai Anilewicz received the report at 6:23. A courier descended the ladder at speed and crossed the command room and spoke 3 sentences. Mordecai listened without expression. He asked one question. He asked how many of his fighters had been hit. The courier said none. Mordecai did not respond. He walked to the wall and stood looking at the map for some time. Then he turned to one of the women at the table and said quietly that the runners should be sent. The order was, hold the positions, conserve ammunition, expect the next attack within the hour. The order was carried out before he had finished speaking it. Across the city, in a building requisitioned for the use of the Wehrmacht press office, a telephone was ringing. It was answered by a young lieutenant who had been on duty since 4. The voice on the other end was that of a major in the SS, who had just received the first situation report from Miła Street. The major spoke for perhaps 30 seconds. The lieutenant wrote down what he heard. When the call ended, he looked at what he had written, and he sat for a moment without moving, and then he picked up the page and walked it to the office of his commanding officer, who read it twice and used a word the lieutenant had never heard him use before. By 7 in the morning, the news had reached Stroop's office. Stroop did not speak for some minutes. He sat at his desk with the report in front of him, and he read it 3 times, and on the third reading, he made a small mark in the margin beside one of the figures, the figure for the burning tank, and he set the report down and stood and walked to the window. The window faced east. From it, he could see very faintly the column of smoke rising from somewhere inside the ghetto. He watched it for a long time. The smoke did not diminish. He had not, he realized, prepared remarks for this contingency. The contingency in which the operation did not begin in the way operations of this kind began. He stood at the window and considered, for the first time, that the report he had intended to deliver to Berlin on the 20th might require revision. Then he considered that the revision itself would have to be carefully phrased. Then he stopped considering and went back to his desk and called for his deputy. Inside the ghetto, the morning held its silence. The tank still burned. The fighters waited at their windows. In a kitchen on Glacier, the man who had fed his 3 children boiled potatoes the night before now sat with them on the floor of an inner room, away from the windows, and he listened to the silence and counted the seconds since the last shot. The youngest child, the 2-year-old, had fallen asleep against his shoulder. The other 2 were awake and quiet. They had learnt some months ago when to be quiet. On the Aryan side of the wall, the city was waking up. The grandmother in the apartment above Krasinski Square stood at her kitchen window with a cup of weak coffee. She could see beyond the rooftops a column of black smoke rising from somewhere inside the ghetto. She watched it for a moment. She thought it might be a fire in a warehouse. Then she turned away from the window and went to wake her granddaughter for breakfast. The carousel was 4 days away. The first tram of the morning passed at 7:32. Line 17 beginning its first run of the day. The driver, the same man who had driven the route for 19 years, noticed the smoke as he turned onto Bonifraterska. He noticed that there was more of it than usual. He did not slow down. He had a schedule to keep. The bell rang once at the corner. Inside the ghetto, the bell carried, faint, distant, mechanical, indifferent, over the burning tank, over the bodies of the 2 dead Germans, over the windows where fighters waited with reloaded pistols, over the bunker on Miła Street, where Mordecai Anilevich stood at his map and did not look up. The morning had been won. Everything else remained. The book was bound in pale leather, with a clasp of polished brass and pages of heavy paper that had been ruled by hand. It had been ordered from a stationer in Warsaw some months earlier for an unrelated purpose, and had arrived in Warsaw without an assigned use. Stroop had selected it on the second evening of the operation. He had decided that what was happening here required a record, and that the record required an object worthy of it. The book lay open on his desk now, beneath the lamp, and the first 3 pages had been filled in his careful, slightly leaning hand. It was the evening of the 20th of April, Hitler's birthday. The ghetto was supposed to have been emptied by midday. It had not been. Stroop sat with his pen poised above the paper and considered the sentence he had been about to write. He had been writing for perhaps an hour. He had crossed out 2 lines. He had begun a third and abandoned it. The difficulty was not in the events themselves. The events were known to him, in the brutal precision of military reporting, hour by hour from his unit commanders. The difficulty was in the language. He needed a vocabulary that did not yet exist. A vocabulary in which the loss of 2 armored vehicles, the death of 14 soldiers in less than 36 hours, and the failure to advance beyond the third intersection of 3 separate streets could be described as something other than a defeat. Defeat was not a word he could write. Defeat would travel up the chain to Berlin and would not stop there. What was needed instead was a long word that meant more or less complication. He found it eventually. He wrote, in his careful hand, that the operation had encountered organized armed resistance of an unexpected character. He wrote that the resistance had been suppressed in its initial form, and that further measures were now being implemented. He wrote that the timetable had been adjusted to reflect the operational realities on the ground. He read the sentences back to himself. He decided they would do. He did not write that the burning tank on Miła Street had still been smoking at noon on the second day. He did not write that 2 of his unit commanders had requested, in the course of the morning, that artillery be brought up to flatten entire blocks rather than continue street-by-street advance. He did not write that the request had been granted. Some things, he understood, belonged in the report only as their consequences. The reasons could be omitted. He turned the page and began the entry for the 3rd day. 3 streets away, though Stroop, sitting at his desk on the Aryan side, would have measured the distance in something other than streets. Mordecai Anielewicz was holding the first command meeting of the Jewish Combat Organization since the operation had begun. The meeting was held in the bunker on Miła Street, in the command room with the long table assembled from doors. 11 people were present. Above them, through 3 floors of brick and the cold April night, the city was burning in 5 separate places. Mordecai did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, with his hands resting flat on the wood, and he listened as each of his commanders gave a report on the day's actions. The reports were brief. The fighters had held their positions through 3 German advances. 2 of their own had been killed. 3 were wounded. Ammunition was lower than they had hoped. Water was lower than they had calculated. What no one said, and what every person at the table understood, was that the Germans had now begun to burn the buildings. Not as a tactic of warfare, as a tactic of erasure. The blocks the fighters had defended that morning were no longer there. The windows from which they had fired had collapsed inward into the rooms behind them, and the rooms had collapsed into the floors below, and the floors had collapsed into the cellars, and what remained was rubble and heat, and a smell that the people in the bunker had not yet learned to name. The watchmaker was at the meeting, although he did not have a seat at the table. He stood by the doorway, his notebook in his hand, and he listened. He had been promoted, in a sense, by circumstance. The man who had previously been responsible for tracking ammunition stocks had been killed that morning, in a building near the brushmakers district, and the watchmaker, who had a reputation for keeping accurate counts, had been asked to assume the work. He had agreed without speaking. He was now keeping 2 notebooks. Mordecai listened to the reports and did not interrupt. When the last commander had finished, he was quiet for some seconds. Then he asked a question that no one had been expecting. He asked what the wounded would be told. The room did not answer. He clarified. The wounded who could not walk. The wounded who could not be moved between bunkers. What would they be told when the Germans came? What language would be used? Who would speak to them? One of the commanders, a man of perhaps 30, who had been a mathematics teacher before the war, and who had a soft voice that did not match the things he was now in charge of, said that this was a matter that should be left to the moment. Mordecai shook his head once. He said that the moment, when it came, would not allow for such conversations. He said the conversations had to happen now. The room was silent for a long time. Then one of the women at the table, a courier called Rivka, who had crossed the wall 4 times in the last week, and who had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the operation began, said that she would speak to them. She said it without raising her voice. She said that she had spoken to her mother, before her mother had died of typhus the previous summer, and that she remembered what her mother had said, and that she could find the words. She would not need to be told. Mordecai looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The matter was settled. The meeting moved on. In Stroop's office across the city, the leather book was now open to the entry for the 21st. The day had not yet happened, but Stroop had begun, for the first time, to write entries in advance. He wrote what he intended to occur. He would correct the entries afterwards if necessary. The decision to write forward in time was not one he had made consciously. It had simply happened, the way certain decisions happen in men who have begun to understand that what they are documenting will be read by people other than themselves. He wrote that, on the 21st, the operation would proceed with the deployment of incendiary teams to the central districts of the former ghetto. He used the word former. The word was premature. He wrote it anyway. Language, he had come to understand in his career, was a thing one wrote ahead of itself, and the world tended, given enough force, to follow. He paused. He set down the pen. He rose from his desk and stood for some moments at the window, which faced east, and from which he could see, even now at this hour, the dim red glow of the fires that his men had set during the day. The fires were small from this distance, localized. He thought, watching them, that they would be larger tomorrow. He returned to the desk and wrote one more sentence, and then closed the book and turned the brass clasp. In the bunker on Miła Street, the meeting had ended. The commanders had dispersed to their positions. Mordecai remained at the table, alone now, except for the watchmaker, who was finishing his entries in the second notebook. Mordecai had not eaten that day. He was not aware of it. He was looking at the map on the wall, and he was thinking, although he would not have phrased it this way, that the map had begun to lie. The streets it showed no longer existed in the configurations it described. The blocks marked in pencil had become rubble. The bunkers marked in red had begun to lose contact with one another. The watchmaker closed his notebook. He looked up. Mordecai was still looking at the map. The watchmaker did not speak. He had learned, in the weeks since he had stopped repairing watches and had started counting bullets, that some men needed silence in the way other men needed sleep, and that to interrupt that silence was a kind of small violence. He left the room quietly and climbed the ladder to the cellar above, and stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs that led to the courtyard, listening. Above the city, very faint, came the sound of a tram bell. Line 17, on its last run of the night, crossing Bonifraterska in the darkness on the Aryan side of the wall. The bell rang once. The watchmaker stood in the dark and listened to the silence after it. The silence lasted a long time. He thought briefly of his wife. She had been taken in August. He had not allowed himself to think of her directly since then, only to think of her shape, of her presence in rooms, of the small habits of a woman who had been there and was now not. Tonight, in the cellar, he allowed himself to think of her face. He did not weep. He did not pray. He stood in the dark for perhaps 2 minutes, and then turned and descended the ladder and went back to his work. In 2 cities that night, 2 books were closed. Stroop's, with its leather cover and brass clasp, would survive the war. It would be entered into evidence at Nuremberg. It would be photographed and copied and reproduced in textbooks for the next 80 years. The watchmaker's notebook, with its careful columns of numbers in pencil, would not. One of these absences would matter more than the other. History had not yet decided which. The first building burned at 9 in the morning on the 22nd. It was a tenement on Miła Street, 4 stories, with a baker's shop on the ground floor that had been closed since the previous September. The men who set it alight worked from the outside. They did not enter. They placed their incendiary devices against the wooden door, against the lower window frames, against the small basement vents that opened onto the street, and they retreated to the corner before the first flame caught. The flame caught quickly. The building was old. Wood and plaster and decades of dry paint, and inside the walls, the dust of generations of cooking and prayer and small domestic noise. The fire took the lower floors in less than a minute. By the second minute, it had reached the staircase. By the 4th minute, it was visible from the windows of the upper floors, and the people inside the building had begun to understand what was happening to them. This was the new strategy. Stroop had ordered it the previous night, after considering the alternatives. Building by building advance had cost too many men. Cellar by cellar searches had cost too many hours. The order he gave was simple, and was issued in writing, and was stamped with the seal of his command. The remaining inhabited blocks of the former ghetto were to be burned. The inhabitants would emerge of their own accord, or they would not. It was, Stroop wrote that morning in his leather book, the most efficient available method. He underlined the word efficient. By midday, 6 blocks were burning. The smoke rose in columns that joined together at perhaps 100 meters above the rooftops, and formed by early afternoon a single cloud that hung over the eastern quarter of the city, like the shadow of something that had not yet arrived. The cloud could be seen from 20 kilometers away. Farmers in the fields outside Warsaw stopped their work and shaded their eyes, and watched it for a moment before returning to what they had been doing. Inside the burning blocks, people were jumping. This is the part of the story that must be told slowly, because to tell it quickly is to lose what it was. They jumped from 3rd-floor windows because the staircases were gone. They jumped from 4th-floor windows because the 3rd floor was gone. They jumped holding children, and they jumped holding nothing, and some of them jumped together, in pairs, holding hands, in a kind of last small arrangement of choice that the fire had not yet taken from them. The cobblestones below received them. The cobblestones did not distinguish. Across the street from one of these buildings, behind a low wall in a courtyard that had not yet been reached by the fire, a girl of perhaps 8 years old was watching. She had been brought there by her father an hour earlier and told to remain still until he returned. Her father had not returned. She watched a woman fall from a fourth-floor window across the street. The woman did not cry out. The girl did not cry out either. She watched the way children watch, without understanding, but without looking away. The observer does not name this child. She had a name. No one alive remembers it. By 2 in the afternoon, the streets immediately surrounding the burning blocks had become impassable. The heat was extreme. The smoke had thickened to the point where men 20 meters apart could no longer see one another. The German units, instructed to wait at the perimeter and to capture any inhabitants who emerged, had pulled back twice. Some of them had begun to cough. A few were vomiting against walls. Their officer issued no comment. Inside the bunker on Miła Street, the air had changed. It had begun to taste of something. The air shafts, which had been carefully concealed in the chimneys of the building above, were now drawing in smoke from a city block that was burning 2 streets away. The watchmaker noticed it first. He had been sitting at his small table near the kitchen, making entries in his second notebook, and he had paused with his pencil in his hand because something in the air had shifted, and he did not know yet what. He raised the pencil to his nose. He breathed in. He set the pencil down. He went to find Mordecai. Mordecai was in the command room, leaning over the map, with 2 of his commanders beside him. The watchmaker waited at the doorway until Mordecai looked up. Then he said quietly that the air shafts would have to be partially closed. Mordecai understood immediately. He nodded. He gave the order. The shafts were partially closed within the hour, and the air in the bunker, which had been cool and breathable for 3 months, became close and warm, and tasted faintly of something that had once been wood and plaster and human habitation. The people in the bunker did not complain. They had been told what was happening. They understood. They sat on their sleeping shelves, and they breathed shallowly, and they listened, through the earth and the brick, to the sounds that were no longer entering, and to the sounds that, in their absence, had become unmistakable. The tram had not passed all morning. The line had been suspended at first light, when the tracks along Bonifraterska had become unsafe. The heat from the fires inside the ghetto had begun to warp the rails. A notice had been posted at the depot in Zolibors at 6 in the morning. Service to be redirected via a temporary route through Krasinski Square. Resumption of normal schedule, pending repairs. The notice had been signed by a clerk who did not know what was burning. Inside the bunker, the watchmaker noticed the absence of the tram bell at 9:15. He had not realized, until that moment, that he had been listening for it. He sat at his small table near the kitchen, and he listened to the silence where the bell had been, and the silence had a quality he had not heard before. A silence that was not the absence of a sound, but the removal of one. He thought briefly that he should mark this in his notebook. Then he understood that there was no column in his notebook for such a thing. Then he understood that this was the first day in many months in which the world beyond the wall had also become uncertain. Above ground, the burning continued. By nightfall, the eastern quarter of the ghetto was a single fire. Buildings collapsed inward in slow, almost ceremonial motions, their facades sliding down into the streets, their floors folding upon themselves, their interior contents, beds, tables, photographs, prayer books, released briefly into the air as embers and ash, and then carried upward into the column of smoke. The column rose to a height that was now visible from the western suburbs of the city. A pilot of a German reconnaissance plane dispatched that afternoon to photograph the operation, reported that the smoke had reached an altitude of 1,200 meters. He reported it as a figure. The figure was entered into Stroop's leather book that evening. On the Aryan side of the wall, the city did not stop. Trams ran on their detoured routes. Shops opened. The grandmother in the apartment above Krasinski Square went to the market and bought a small cabbage and a piece of pork. And on her way home, she walked through the square where the carousel still stood under its tarp, waiting for Sunday. Sunday was now 2 days away. She paused for a moment beside the carousel. She looked at the wall. Smoke was rising from somewhere on the other side. She did not look at it for long. That evening, her granddaughter asked her again what color the carousel horses were. She said she still did not know. The girl asked whether they would still be there on Sunday. The grandmother said yes. Then she sat for some time at the kitchen table, after the child had gone to bed, and she thought about whether she had told the truth. In the bunker, the watchmaker climbed onto his sleeping shelf at the usual hour. The chamber was warm now. The air tasted of smoke, even with the shafts partially closed. He counted the breaths around him, as he always did. 18 had become 23 in the last 4 days. The bunker had been receiving people from buildings that no longer existed. He listened, briefly, for the bell that would not come. He closed his eyes. Above the city, the smoke rose. The fires burned through the night without diminishing. By morning, 6 more blocks would be added to the list. By the end of the week, the geography of the ghetto would be unrecognizable, and the maps that had been drawn in pencil over the winter would describe a place that no longer existed. The tram did not pass that night. It did not pass the following night either. The sound that had marked time for everyone inside the wall, the small mechanical bell of an indifferent world, had been removed from the air. What replaced it was the sound of fire. The two sounds were not the same. The first had reminded those inside that a world existed beyond them. The second reminded them only of where they were. The bunker beneath the bakery on Świętojańska Street held 47 people, and at 3 in the morning a child was crying. The child was 3 years old. She had been crying for perhaps 4 minutes, in the soft, persistent way that children cry when they have not been told to be quiet, and her mother was holding her against her chest and whispering into her hair, and the whispering was not working. Around them, in the dark, 45 other people were not moving. They were listening. They were listening to the child, and they were listening to the silence above the bunker, and they were listening to themselves listen. The mother began to sing, very softly, a song that had no words the child knew, in a language the child had not been alive long enough to speak. The child quieted. The mother continued singing for some time after the child had fallen asleep, because she had not been singing for the child. This was one bunker. There were perhaps 600 of them. No one had counted. No central record existed. The bunkers had been built through the winter by the methods described already, by watchmakers and bakers and printers and women who had once run small schools, and what they had produced was a city of which no map existed. The map could not have been made. The makers had not coordinated. Some of the bunkers connected to each other through tunnels. Some did not. Some had 2 exits. Many had only 1. A few were sealed entirely from the inside, by people who had decided that they would either survive without ever emerging, or they would not survive at all. What follows are 3 of them. In the cellar beneath what had been a small Hebrew printing press on Miła Street, 26 people were gathered around a candle. The candle had been lit at dusk and would be allowed to burn until midnight, after which the bunker would be in darkness for the next 18 hours. One of the men present, a teacher of 50, had a prayer book in his hands. He was not reading from it. He had opened it at random some hours earlier and had been looking at the same page since, and his eyes had stopped following the letters and were now resting on the white space between them. The man had been reciting the evening service to himself, silently, for the first 3 days of the operation. He had stopped on the 4th day. He had not made a decision to stop. The words had simply, at some point during the morning, ceased to come, and he had not pursued them. He held the book now, because his hands required something to hold. Around him, the other people in the bunker spoke quietly when they spoke at all, and one of them, an old woman who had been the printer's mother before the printer had been taken in August, was passing around a small piece of bread that she had divided into 26 portions, each the size of a fingernail. The teacher accepted his portion. He placed it on his tongue. He did not eat it for some time. When he finally swallowed, he did so without prayer. In a second bunker, beneath a tenement on Miła Street, 14 people were sitting in a chamber that measured 3 meters by 4. The chamber had been intended for 9. The additional 5 had arrived 2 nights earlier from a building that no longer existed, and there had been no question of refusing them, and now there was no question of feeding them, and the situation in the chamber had achieved the quiet clarity of a thing that everyone understood and no one said. The man responsible for the bunker, a butcher of 38, who had run a small shop on Miła Street before the war, and who had been, in another life, a man who measured his days by the slow pleasures of his trade, had not slept since the new arrivals had come. He sat near the entrance with his back against the brick and a kitchen knife resting on his knee. The knife was for the door, in case the door was opened by anyone who was not him. It was also, he had told himself, for other purposes that he had not yet named. He hoped he would not need to name them. One of the new arrivals was a young man of perhaps 22, who had been wounded in the leg during his escape from the building that had collapsed. The wound had not been treated. It was beginning to smell. Everyone in the bunker could smell it. No one mentioned it. The young man knew that they could smell it. He sat with his back to the wall and his leg extended in front of him, and he did not speak. The butcher watched him sometimes, across the chamber. Their eyes met once, and held for perhaps 3 seconds, and then both men looked away. In a third bunker, which lay beneath a courtyard on Miła Street, and which connected through a narrow passage to the command bunker at Miła 18, a woman called Hala was rationing water from a tin barrel. She had been doing this for 11 days. The barrel had been full when the operation began. It was now perhaps a third full. 22 people in the chamber. Each was permitted 3 small cups per day. Hala had calculated that this would last another 8 days, possibly 9 if no one became ill, possibly 12 if she reduced the rations further. She was reducing them further. She had not announced this. She simply poured slightly less each time, and the people in the chamber, who had begun to understand the small economies of survival, did not protest. What Hala did not know, and what she would not know for another 6 days, was that the air in her chamber was being slowly poisoned. One of the air shafts had been crushed 3 nights earlier by the collapse of a building above. The remaining shaft was insufficient for 22 people. The carbon dioxide was accumulating. No one had noticed yet, because the symptoms, headache, drowsiness, slow confusion, had been arriving for everyone simultaneously and gradually, and gradual things are the hardest things to name. The observer does not say which of the three bunkers loses its air first. All three were real. All three are composed of details preserved in the records of those who survived. Whether the people described emerged or did not emerge, or emerged into something worse than not emerging, the answers are not the point of this telling. The point is that they sat in the dark, on the 11th day of an operation that was supposed to have lasted 3, and they were still, on that 11th night, refusing to be where they had been told to be. That was the resistance. Not the burning tank on Miła Street. Not the pistol from the 4th floor window in January. Those things mattered, and they would be remembered, but they were the visible part of something larger and quieter that was happening underneath the city. The resistance was the breathing in the dark. The resistance was the small piece of bread divided into 26. The resistance was the song the mother sang after the child had stopped crying. Above the bunkers, the German units were beginning a new phase. Stroop had ordered, that afternoon, the systematic use of dogs and listening equipment to locate the entrances. The dogs were trained on the scent of human habitation. The listening equipment was crude but adequate. Small microphones that could be lowered into rubble through holes drilled in collapsed floors. The teams worked in the smoking ruins block by block, and they had begun, by the 11th evening, to find what they were looking for. The first bunker was open that night. It was not one of the 3 described. It was on Miła Street, somewhat smaller, holding 19 people. The Germans did not enter. They threw 2 grenades down the entrance and waited. When no one emerged, they sealed the entrance with rubble and moved on. 19 people. The list of bunkers was now down by 1. Stroop, when he received the report, did not know whether to mark the entry as discovered or as resolved. He chose discovered. The careful distinction would matter later. It did not matter to the 19. In the command bunker at Miła 18, Mordecai received the news at 11 that night. He listened. He nodded. He did not speak for a long time afterwards. He had known that this would begin, and he had told himself that he was prepared for it. And he discovered now what every commander who has ever sent people into a position they will not leave discovers, that the preparation is not equal to the moment. He went up the ladder to the cellar above and stood for some minutes in the doorway that opened onto the courtyard. The courtyard was no longer there. The building beside it had collapsed 2 days earlier and had filled the space with rubble, and what had been a small enclosed yard with a single tree was now a slope of brick and twisted iron rising to the height of a man's shoulder. The tree was gone. Mordecai did not remember when it had gone. He stood in the doorway for some time and listened. The city above was silent now, in the way burning cities become silent when the burning has passed its loudest hour and entered the long, slow consumption that follows. He could hear, very faintly, the breath of the bunker behind him through the open trapdoor. 23 people in the lower chamber, plus 11 in the command room, plus the 8 wounded in the small room they had begun to call the infirmary, although it was not. He did not hear the tram bell. He had stopped expecting to hear it. It had been 4 days now. He went back down the ladder. The watchmaker was waiting at the bottom, with the second notebook open in his hand. The watchmaker said nothing. Mordecai looked at him for a moment, and then walked past him to the command room, where Zivia was waiting at the table with a piece of paper in her hand. The paper was a list of names. The names were of fighters who had not reported to their positions that morning. Mordecai took the list. He sat down at the table. He read the names slowly, one by one, in the silence of the command room, with the lamp burning low between him and Xavier, and somewhere in the chamber beyond, in the dark, a child was crying again, and a mother was singing. The list contained 11 names, and Mordecai read them all twice before he set the paper down on the table. He did not know at that hour how many of the 11 were dead, and how many were merely unreachable. The distinction had become small. A fighter who could not be reached was, for the purposes of the next morning's plan, the same as a fighter who could not be raised at all. Xavier waited across the table. She did not press him. She had learnt, in the months since they had begun working together, that Mordecai required a particular kind of silence after he received certain information, a silence that was not absence, but processing, a silence in which something was being arranged inside him that would become, in due course, the next decision. He looked up at last. He said only that the morning's positions would have to be reorganized. Xavier nodded. She rose to begin the work. At the door of the command room, she paused and looked back at him. He had picked up the list again. It was the 23rd of April. The operation had been underway for 5 days. Stroop had told Berlin it would take 3. The world that had existed on the 17th, the world in which a carousel was being assembled and a grandmother was deciding what color coat her granddaughter would wear, that world had ended at 6 in the morning on the 19th, and what had replaced it was a country of fires and bunkers and lists of 11 names. And Mordecai Anielewicz, 23 years old, was sitting at a long wooden table beneath the earth, and he was trying, for the first time in many days, to think of something other than the next 12 hours. He was thinking of Yitzhak. Yitzhak Zuckerman was on the Aryan side of the wall. He had been sent there in early April, before the operation began, to maintain communication with the Polish underground and to coordinate the movement of weapons and couriers across the wall. The decision had not been Zuckerman's. He had argued against it. Mordecai had insisted. Someone had to be on the other side, Mordecai had said, and the someone could not be himself. Zuckerman had crossed the wall on the night of the 8th of April with a forged identity card and a bag of pistols sewn into the lining of a winter coat. He had not spoken to Mordecai since. Letters had passed between them, irregularly, through couriers who became fewer with each passing day. The last letter from Mordecai had been sent on the 17th, the day before Stroop's order arrived. It had contained operational matters and one personal sentence. Zuckerman had read the personal sentence 18 times. It is here, in the silence of the command room on the 23rd, that the next letter began to be written. It was not written on paper. Not yet. It was written in the way that certain letters are written, by men who do not know whether they will live long enough to put a pen to a page. Mordecai began to compose it in his mind. A first sentence formed, and he held it for a moment, and then he set it aside and began another. He was not yet sure what the letter was for. He understood only that there was something he wanted Yitzhak to know, and that the wanting had begun, in the last few days, to feel like a small physical pressure inside his chest, and that the pressure would not ease until the words had been arranged. The first sentence he composed and discarded was about the operation. He realized, almost at once, that the operation was not what he wanted to write about. The second sentence he composed and discarded was about the men who had not reported. He realized that he could not yet bear to name them, even silently. The third sentence he composed was about something he had felt that morning, when he had stood in the doorway of the courtyard that no longer existed and looked at the place where the tree had been. He held this sentence for some time. He was not certain how to finish it. He was not certain what kind of sentence it was. He set it aside. He returned to the list of names. Across the wall, in a small room above a tailor's shop on Miła Street, Yitzhak Zuckerman was waiting for a courier who had not arrived. The courier was due at 8 in the evening. It was now 11:10. Zuckerman had not eaten that day. He had been pacing the length of the small room for several hours, and his pacing had developed the rhythm that pacing develops when a man is trying to process the weight of something that cannot be processed. News had been arriving from the ghetto in fragments, through the railway workers, through Polish neighbors of certain Jewish families who had hidden on the Aryan side, through the small radio that Zuckerman kept hidden behind a panel in the wall. The fragments did not assemble into a picture. They assembled into a kind of darkness with shapes inside it. Zuckerman knew that buildings were burning. He knew that fighters were holding positions. He knew that bunkers were being discovered. He did not know at that hour whether Mordecai was alive. He stopped pacing. He went to the window. He could see from this room a fragment of sky and the upper floors of two buildings across the street, and, beyond them, if he stood at a particular angle and looked between the buildings, a small portion of the roof lines of the eastern quarter of the city, where smoke had been rising for 5 days. The smoke was visible even at night. It caught the light of the fires beneath it and glowed faintly, the color of weak tea, and Zuckerman stood at the window and watched it, and did not move for some time. And before we go any further into this night, into what Mordecai composed, and what Zuckerman watched, and what was about to happen in the 3rd week of an operation that should have ended in 3 days, let me ask something of you. If this story has carried you this far, you are no longer a passing listener. You are something else. You are a person who has chosen to stay inside a darkness that the world, then and now, has often preferred to look away from. If the archive matters to you, a small gesture, a like, a quiet click on subscribe, is how it continues. Not because the story needs an audience, because it needs to be findable by the person, somewhere, who has not yet heard it. And now we return to the room above the tailor's shop, to the smoke that glowed the color of weak tea against the night sky, to Yitzhak Zuckerman, standing at the window, who had not yet learned to count the days that were beginning to pass without word. The courier arrived at 20 minutes to 1 in the morning. He came up the back stairs. He was a boy of perhaps 15, Polish, who had been crossing the wall through a particular sewer grate for 3 weeks now, and who had begun, without knowing it, to develop the kind of competence that wars produce in children. He was carrying nothing in his hands. He had not brought a letter. He had been told, on the other side, that there had not been time to write one. He delivered his message orally. 3 sentences. Mordecai was alive. The bunker on Miła 18 had not yet been discovered. The fighters were still in their positions, although their positions had become smaller. Zuckerman listened. He thanked the boy. He gave the boy a piece of bread and a small amount of money, and the boy left by the back stairs as quietly as he had come. Zuckerman stood for a long time in the center of the room. Then he sat at the small desk near the window. He took out a sheet of paper. He held the pen above it for some seconds. Then he set the pen down without writing anything. He had not yet decided what to write. He did not know whether his letter would reach the bunker. He did not know whether Mordecai, even if it reached him, would have the time or the silence to read it. He sat at the desk and listened to the city. Outside, the streets of the Aryan side were quiet. A few late vehicles. The distant footsteps of a German patrol 3 blocks away. The hum of a generator somewhere. The trams had stopped for the night, on the rerouted lines that had been put in place when the heat from the fires had warped the rails along Bonifraterska. The bell of line 17, which had once passed beneath this window every 20 minutes from dawn until midnight, had not been heard for 5 days. Zuckerman closed his eyes. He listened to the silence where the bell had been. Across the wall, in the bunker on Miła Street, Mordecai was composing his 4th sentence. He had abandoned the first 3. The 4th was simpler. It was about a thing that had happened a long time ago, before the war, in a room with windows that opened onto a small garden. He held the sentence for a moment. Then he held it for a longer moment. Then he understood that this was the sentence he would eventually write. He did not write it that night. He had work to do. The morning's positions had to be reorganized, and the wounded had to be moved, and a courier had to be sent to the brushmakers' district, and a decision had to be made about a bunker on Miła Street that had stopped responding to signals. But the sentence had been found. It would wait. And in 2 rooms on 2 sides of a wall, one underground and one above, one already a place of fighting and one not yet, 2 men sat in lamplight at small tables, both of them trying, in their separate ways, to compose a letter that the other would not be able to answer. The synagogue stood at the corner of Wawinska and Miła, and on the morning of the 25th, it was still there. Almost everything around it had collapsed. The buildings on 3 sides had been reduced to slopes of brick and twisted iron, and the buildings opposite were burning slowly along their upper floors, and the air above the intersection was thick with the slow drift of paper and ash that had been rising and falling for 6 days. The synagogue itself was untouched. Not by accident. By a small, particular indifference that had not yet found a reason to extend itself. It was a small synagogue. A prayer house, more accurately. It had been built in 1873 by a community of leather workers who had pooled their savings over 4 years to raise the money, and it had survived the partitions and the First War and the early occupation. And now in the spring of 1943, it stood at the corner of 2 streets that had ceased to exist as streets, and inside it a man was praying. His name was Reb Mendel. He was 72 years old. He had been the rabbi of this prayer house for 31 years, and on the morning of the operation, he had been sitting in his study above the women's gallery when the trucks began to move, and he had decided, without consultation and without announcement, that he would not leave the building. He had not eaten in 4 days. He had been drinking small amounts of water from a cracked porcelain pitcher that had been used in earlier years for ritual washing. He had taken off his shoes on the 2nd day. He had not been able after that to find a reason to put them back on. The prayer hall was empty, except for him. The benches stood in their rows. The arc at the eastern wall was closed, the embroidered curtain dark with dust. Reb Mendel sat at the front, in the place that had always been his, with the prayer book open before him on a small wooden stand, and he was reading the morning service in a voice so low that it would not have carried to the back of the room if anyone had been there to listen. The observer does not explain why he stayed. It is possible that he could not have walked to a bunker. It is possible that he had been told, somewhere in the long quiet of the previous winter, that his place was here. It is possible that he had simply, at the age of 72, in a body that had outlasted the bodies of his wife and his 3 children and most of his congregation, decided that he had completed the part of his life that required movement, and that what remained could be done sitting down. He had not made the decision in words. He had made it in the way old men make certain decisions, which is to say, without making them. Outside the synagogue, on the street that no longer was a street, A German listening team had stopped for a moment beside the building. 3 men. A small device with 2 earpieces, connected by wires to a microphone that the youngest of them was unspooling. They had been working since dawn. They had located 2 bunker entrances already that morning. They paused now because the building before them was intact, and intact buildings were not their concern, and they wanted a minute of rest before continuing to the next collapse block. One of them, the team leader, looked up at the small dome of the synagogue. He thought vaguely that the building should have been burned by now. He made a note in his pocketbook. He intended to mention it in his evening report. He did not know that he would be killed in a courtyard near the brushmakers district that afternoon, and that the note would never be delivered, and that the synagogue would therefore continue to stand untouched for another 20 days. The team moved on. Inside the prayer hall, Reb Mendel had reached the part of the service that called for the standing prayer. He did not stand. He inclined his head slightly. The gesture was sufficient. The God to whom he was praying, he had decided some years ago, was not a God who required the ceremonies of the body from a man whose body had become a ceremony of its own. 3 streets away, beneath the rubble of a building that had collapsed 2 nights earlier, the first deaths from gas were beginning. Stroop had ordered the new tactic that morning. The grenades had been efficient at sealing bunkers, but not at clearing them, and clearing was what was now required. Berlin had begun to ask difficult questions, and the answers needed to involve numbers, and numbers could only come from bunkers whose contents had been counted. The order specified the use of smoke grenades and gas canisters, deployed through air shafts where these could be located, or through holes drilled into the ceilings of cellars where the shafts could not. The first bunker chosen for the new method held 31 people. It was on Miła Street, not far from where the tank had burned on the first morning. The Germans drilled 3 holes into the cellar ceiling and inserted the canisters at 9:47 in the morning. They sealed the bunker entrance with rubble and waited. What happened inside was not visible to them. What happened inside is also not, properly speaking, the subject of this telling. The observer notes only that 31 people had been alive when the canisters were inserted, and that none of them were alive when the entrance was reopened the following morning, and that the work of removing the bodies took 6 men the better part of a day, and that 2 of those men, by the end of the day, were vomiting and could not stop. One of those 2 would never speak of it. The other would speak of it once, 41 years later, into a tape recorder held by a young historian in a small flat in Vienna. He would speak for 19 minutes. He would then ask that the recording be destroyed. The historian would agree and would honor the agreement, and the words spoken on that afternoon would survive only in the memory of the historian, who herself would die in 2007 without writing them down. The observer notes these things in passing. They are part of the geometry of what is being lost. In the synagogue at the corner of Wałęsa and Miła, the morning service was ending. Reb Mendel closed the prayer book. He sat for some time with his hands resting on the cover. The cover was leather, very worn, with the title in Hebrew embossed in faded gold. He had received the book from his father in 1894. His father had received it from his own father in 1851. The book was older than the building it sat in, and it would, if the small particular indifference of the German listening teams continued to extend itself, outlast the building as well. Reb Mendel rose from the bench. Slowly. The slowness was not theatre. It was the slowness of a body that had not eaten for 4 days and had been sitting in the same position for 3 hours. He carried the prayer book to the ark. He opened the curtain. He placed the book on the small shelf inside, beside the larger Torah scroll that had been in this prayer house since its founding. He closed the curtain. He stood for some time in front of it. Then he walked to the door of the prayer hall, and he opened it, and he looked out at what had been the street. The street was rubble. The buildings opposite were burning along their upper floors. A column of smoke was rising in the middle distance, perhaps 3 blocks away, and the smoke caught the morning light and turned it the color of old brass. He stood in the doorway of his synagogue. He looked at the city. He did not weep. He had, at some earlier point in the previous winter, finished weeping, and what had replaced the weeping was not something for which there is yet a word. He went back inside. He closed the door. In the bunker on Miła Street, Mordecai received word at noon that a bunker on the Lefki had been opened, and that no one inside had survived. He was told the method. He listened without expression. He asked one question. He asked whether the air shafts of his own bunker had been checked that morning. The answer was yes. They had been checked. They were, as far as could be determined from inside, still concealed. Mordecai nodded. He returned to the work in front of him. The work in front of him was not a map. It was not a list of names. It was a small piece of paper torn from the end of a notebook on which he had begun, at some point during the morning, to write a single sentence. The sentence was not yet complete. He had been adding to it slowly, between other tasks, and he had crossed out 2 words and replaced them with others, and the sentence, as it stood by noon, read approximately as follows: "The dream of my life has come true." He looked at the sentence for some time. He did not know yet what would come after it. He folded the paper in half and placed it inside the lining of his jacket and went to find Zivia. The synagogue at the corner of Wawinska and Miła stood untouched through the afternoon and through the night. Reb Mendel sat in the prayer hall in the dark, and he did not light the lamp, and the city around him burned and did not reach him. It would reach him. Not yet. The water in the sewer was knee-deep and very cold, and it moved with a slow, deliberate current that suggested somewhere far below the city, a system that did not care what was passing through it. The 7 people in the tunnel were standing pressed against the curved brick wall, and they had not moved for perhaps 11 minutes. Above them, through 3 meters of stone and earth and street, a German patrol was walking along Karmelika. The boots overhead made a sound that the people in the tunnel had learned, in the previous days, to identify with a precision they had not known the body was capable of. The number of men. The pace of the column. Whether the patrol was on its outbound route or returning to its position. Whether the men were tired. The tunnel acted as a strange amplifier. Sounds from the street arrived softened but not diminished, the way a memory arrives. And the 7 people stood in the dark, and they listened to the patrol pass directly above them, and they did not breathe. The patrol moved on. The boots receded. One of the people in the tunnel, a woman of perhaps 30, with dark hair tied back tightly against her skull, exhaled slowly and shifted her weight from one leg to the other. The water moved around her with a small lapping sound. No one else moved. The leader of the group was a young man called Simcha. He was 21. He had been a courier for the Jewish Combat Organization since the previous autumn, and he had crossed the wall through this particular system of sewers 8 times in the last 6 weeks. He knew which junctions were passable in spring rains and which were impassable in winter freeze. He knew which manhole covers, on the Aryan side, opened onto courtyards and which opened directly onto streets. He knew the smell of each section of the system, and he had learned to read the flow patterns to estimate, within 10 minutes, how long since the last heavy rain. None of this knowledge would help him with what was about to happen next. What was about to happen next had no map. The 7 people in the tunnel were the first group to attempt evacuation through the sewers. Mordecai had authorized it the previous evening after a long conversation with Zivia and 2 of his commanders. The decision had not been easy. The fighters could not be saved. The fighters had decided, weeks earlier, that they would not be saved. But the civilians, the women and children, and the old people who had come into the bunkers from buildings that no longer existed, these were a different question. Some of them, Mordecai had argued, might still be moved. 6 bunkers had been asked to send representatives to the meeting that had selected the first group. 3 had responded. The other 3 had not been reachable. The 7 people now standing in the tunnel had been chosen by a process that no one in the bunkers had been able to call, with any honesty, fair. A young mother with 2 children. An old woman who had once taught at the Jewish hospital and whose knowledge, it had been argued, might still be of use somewhere. A man of 40 whose brother had connections in the Polish underground and could possibly receive him on the other side. A teenage girl. A teenage boy. Simcha at the front. The young mother carried the smaller of her children, a boy of 2, against her chest in a kind of cloth sling that had been made from a torn pillowcase. The older child, a girl of 5, walked beside her, holding her free hand. The girl had been told, before they descended, that she could not speak for a long time, and that whatever she saw or heard or smelled in the tunnels she should not react to, and that if she did everything correctly, she would be in a different place by morning where there would be soup. The girl had nodded. She had not asked what kind of soup. Simcha gestured. The group began to move again. They walked for perhaps another 40 minutes through tunnels that varied in height from 1.5 meters to barely enough to crawl through. In the lowest sections, Simcha went first, and then the man of 40, and then the old teacher, and the young mother passed the toddler forward and then crawled with the girl on her back. The girl did not cry. The toddler did not cry. The mother had not eaten in 2 days, and her arms shook when she lifted her daughter back onto her hip in the next chamber. But she did not stop, because stopping was not a category that the situation allowed. At a junction beneath what Simcha believed was Bonifaterska Street, though he could not be certain because the system was not labelled and he was navigating by counts of left and right and by the slope of the floor, they paused. Simcha climbed a small iron ladder set into the wall. He pressed his ear to the underside of the manhole cover. He listened for some time. What he heard faintly was a tram bell. The trams had returned to Bonifaterska 2 days earlier. The rails had cooled. The damaged sections had been repaired by a small crew working through the night, and the line had resumed its normal route at 6 in the morning on the 25th, and now, on the 27th, it was running on something approaching its standard schedule, though no notice had been issued, because no notice was felt to be necessary, because the suspension had only ever been described as temporary. Simcha listened to the bell pass. He listened to the rumble of the wheels on the rails directly above him. He listened to the silence after the tram had gone. Then he climbed down the ladder and he told the others, in a whisper, that they were almost there. They emerged at 4 in the morning, through a manhole cover in a quiet courtyard behind a tenement on Franciscanska Street, on the Aryan side of the wall. The courtyard was empty. A single light burned in a window on the 3rd floor. The air smelled of nothing in particular, of bread baking somewhere distant perhaps, of a coal stove in a basement, of the ordinary cold of a Warsaw spring night. The 7 people stood in the courtyard. They were soaking wet from the knees down. They smelled of the sewer. The young mother set her toddler down, and the toddler stood swaying for a moment, and then sat down on the cobblestones. The 5-year-old looked around the courtyard with an expression that her mother had never seen on her before. It was the expression of a child who had been told that there would be soup, and who had begun to understand that soup was not a thing that the world produced on demand. Simcha had been told, before they descended, that there would be people waiting. Polish contacts. Members of the underground, who had agreed to receive the group and to distribute them to safe houses across the city. The contacts had been arranged through Zuckerman, who had spent 2 days assembling them, who had called in obligations from before the war, who had paid in money and in promises, and in the particular currency that Polish-Jewish friendships had become. No one was waiting in the courtyard. Simcha stood for a moment, looking at the empty space. He looked at the 3rd-floor window, with the single light burning. He looked at the entrance to the courtyard, which opened onto a street he could not see from where he was standing. He had been told that the contacts would be here. He had been told that they would be carrying a particular sign. No one was here. He did not allow himself, in that moment, to begin counting the possibilities. The contacts had been arrested. The contacts had decided, in the end, not to come. The contacts had come and waited and given up and gone home, perhaps an hour or perhaps 3 hours before the group had emerged. The contacts had been killed. The contacts had taken Zuckerman's money and never intended to come at all. Each of these possibilities required a different response, and none of the responses were available to a man standing in a courtyard at 4 in the morning with 6 other people and a 5-year-old who was beginning, very quietly, to cry. He went to the young mother. He spoke to her in a low voice. She listened without expression. Then she lifted her daughter into her arms, and the daughter buried her face in her mother's neck, and the toddler, who had been sitting on the cobblestones, was picked up by the man of 40, and the old teacher took the hand of the teenage girl, and the 7 of them walked out of the courtyard and into the street. The street was empty. A few windows were lit in the buildings opposite. Simcha did not know which way to turn. He turned left, because the left was the direction in which Zuckerman's room above the tailor's shop lay, although he did not know this consciously and could not have stated it as a reason. He turned because turning was the one thing the situation still permitted. They walked for perhaps 3 minutes. Then a window opened above them. A woman's voice called down, in Polish, asking who they were. Simcha did not answer. He did not know what answer would be safe. The window closed. They kept walking. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, the tram bell rang once at the corner of Bonifaterska. Line 17, on the first run of the morning, beginning the route it had been running, with brief interruptions since 1924. The bell carried clearly through the cold air. The woman who had opened the window above them did not hear it, because she had returned to her bed. The 7 people in the street heard it. The young mother turned her head briefly toward the sound, and then turned it back, and kept walking. The 5-year-old, in her mother's arms, did not turn at all. She had heard the bell many times, from the other side of the wall, in a previous life she had not yet learned to understand was previous. It was, for her, simply a sound that the world made. The world made many sounds. Some of them she had begun to understand. You turned toward. Most of them you did not. Behind them, the courtyard was empty. Above them, the city slept. Ahead of them, a long street stretched away into the early morning, and at the end of the street there was no door open, and no friend waiting, and no certainty at all. They were free. There was nowhere to go. The horses were red. The grandmother had not been able to tell, in the half-light of the previous evenings, what color the carousel horses would turn out to be. Now, on Sunday morning, in the clean spring light that fell across Krasinski Square, she could see them clearly. Red, with white manes and green saddles and small gold bells around their necks that did not ring, but were intended to suggest ringing. The granddaughter, in her blue coat, was holding her grandmother's hand and looking up at them with the expression of a child for whom the world has just produced exactly what it had promised. It was the 25th of April, 1943. Easter Sunday. The bells of the city had rung that morning at 6 and at 9 and at 11, and would ring again at noon, and the carousel had begun to turn shortly after the 11 o'clock service had ended in the church across the square. It was warm for April. The square was full. Families had come from across the center of the city. Children in clean coats, parents who had spent the previous evening polishing the children's shoes, grandparents who walked slowly behind, holding the hands of those who could not be trusted in the small crowd that had formed around the carousel and around the small stalls that had appeared overnight beside it. A stall selling pastries, a stall selling small paper flags, a stall where a man with a portable accordion was playing waltzes that the carousel itself was not loud enough to drown out. The grandmother had bought her granddaughter a pastry. The pastry was small and slightly stale and dusted with sugar that was no longer of the quality it had been before the war. But the granddaughter did not notice this, because she had never eaten the pre-war kind, and what she held in her small hand was the best pastry that had ever existed. The first ride had been at 11:30. The grandmother had paid for 2. The granddaughter was now waiting, with great patience, for the second. Behind the square, perhaps 200 meters away, the wall of the ghetto rose against the sky. Above the wall, on the other side, smoke was rising. It had been rising for 6 days now. No one in the square was looking at it. Looking at it had become, over the course of the previous week, a thing that one chose not to do. Not from cruelty, exactly, and not from agreement, exactly, but from the slow accumulation of small decisions about where one's eyes were permitted to settle in a city in which the wrong direction of looking had become, in some hard-to-name way, dangerous. The smoke continued to rise. The carousel continued to turn. The accordion player began a new waltz. The granddaughter mounted her horse for the second ride at 20 past noon. Her grandmother stood at the railing and waved each time the horse came round. The girl waved back, solemnly, with the small dignity of a child who had decided to take this very seriously. The carousel turned. The waltz played. The horse rose and fell on its painted pole. Above the square, the smoke rose, and the ash began to fall. It had been falling in small quantities for several days. It had fallen on the windowsills of apartments in the surrounding streets, and on the cars parked along Bonifraterska, and on the shoulders of men walking to work in the morning. It was a fine ash, grey-black, very light. It did not stain. It could be brushed off without leaving a mark. It was the residue of buildings, of plaster and timber and paper and cloth, and of other things that the residue did not declare itself to be. That morning, the wind had shifted. The ash had begun to drift in greater quantity across Krasinski Square. By noon, it was settling on the canopy of the carousel, on the green saddles of the painted horses, on the small gold bells that did not ring. A few flakes had landed on the granddaughter's blue coat. The grandmother, watching from the railing, had brushed them off without thinking, the way one brushes off pollen in May. The ride ended. The granddaughter dismounted. She came running to her grandmother and asked whether they could buy another pastry. The grandmother said no, that it was time to go home for lunch, that her mother was waiting. The granddaughter accepted this, with a small disappointment that she had been raised to keep mostly inside her face. They walked across the square toward the street that led west, away from the wall. The granddaughter held her grandmother's hand. The accordion was beginning another waltz behind them. A few other families were leaving. A few more were arriving. The square was, in the way of public squares on holiday afternoons, in a constant slow exchange of its inhabitants. At the edge of the square, near the corner where Miła Street began, the grandmother paused. She did not know why. Something had caught her attention. She turned slightly and looked back across the square, past the carousel, past the small stalls, past the waiting families. She looked at the wall. It was an ordinary wall, 3 meters high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. She had seen it every day for 2 years. She had walked past it on the way to the market, and on the way to her sister's apartment, and on the way to the doctor's office. It had become, over those 2 years, a feature of the city, like the river or the roof lines, or the particular way the trams turned at certain corners. One did not think about it. Today, for some reason she could not have stated, she thought about it. She thought about it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then her granddaughter pulled at her hand and asked when they would be home, and she turned away from the wall, and they walked together down Miła Street, and the grandmother did not look back. Czesław Miłosz was somewhere in the city that day. The observer does not place him in the square. The poem he would write about a carousel by a ghetto wall would not be written for several years, and when it was written, it would describe something the poet had seen, or perhaps had only heard about, or perhaps had assembled from many separate things he had seen during the spring of 1943. The poem would survive the century. It would be read for many decades by people who would not know that the carousel had been red, and that the horses had had small gold bells, and that the grandmother had paused for 4 seconds at the edge of the square before walking away. The poem could not contain those things. Poems cannot contain everything that happens. The poem contained what it could. The carousel turned through the afternoon. The waltzes continued. The smoke continued to rise across the wall. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind had shifted again, and the ash was no longer falling on the square, and the few flakes that had settled on the painted horses were brushed off by the next set of children who climbed onto them. Inside the bunker on Miła Street, 300 meters from the square, Mordecai Anilewicz did not know that it was Easter Sunday. He had lost track of the days. Time had stopped being measured in the divisions used by the world above. Time was now measured in actions, in attacks held off, in bunkers reported lost, in the diminishing supply of water in the barrel near the kitchen, in the sentence on the small piece of paper in his jacket lining, which had now grown to 4 lines and was still incomplete. The watchmaker, sitting at his small table near the kitchen, had begun to keep a 3rd notebook. The 3rd notebook was for himself. It contained no numbers. It contained, in his small, careful hand, observations. The temperature of the chamber. The color of the lamp flame. The number of times each hour that someone, somewhere in the bunker, coughed. That afternoon, in his 3rd notebook, he wrote a single line. He wrote that he had heard, very faintly, what he believed to be music. A waltz, perhaps. Through the earth. Through the brick. Through the air shafts that had been partially closed. He wrote that he was not certain it had been music. He wrote he was not certain of much by then. In Krasinski Square, the carousel was still turning. A new child was riding the red horse with the white mane. Her name was not the same as the name of the granddaughter who had ridden it earlier, but she wore a similar coat, and she waved with the same solemn dignity at her own family standing at the railing. The tram passed at 3 minutes past 3. Line 17, on its scheduled afternoon route, full of passengers returning from family lunches. The driver was the same man who had driven the route for 19 years. He passed the square. He glanced at the carousel. He thought it looked like a pleasant Easter. He did not look at the wall, because looking at the wall had become, for him as for everyone, a thing one did not do. He rang the bell at the corner of Bonifraterska. The sound carried. It carried over the square, and over the carousel, and over the families with their pastries and their small paper flags, and over the wall and into the burning quarter, and down through the rubble of streets that no longer existed, and into the air shafts of bunkers that had been sealed against the smoke, and faintly, very faintly, into the small chamber where the watchmaker sat at his table with his 3 notebooks open in front of him. The watchmaker heard the bell. He looked up. He had not heard it for many days. He sat for some time without moving. Then he picked up his pencil and added a second line to the entry he had begun that afternoon. He wrote that he had heard the bell. He wrote that he did not know what to do with the information. Above him, the world continued. The messenger left the bunker on Miła Street at 4 in the afternoon, and by 5, the people who had sent him had begun, without admitting it to themselves, to count the minutes since his departure. His name was Aaron. He was 19 years old. He was carrying 3 folded sheets of paper inside the lining of his shoe, and his instructions were to deliver them to the command of the brushmaker's bunker, which lay perhaps 400 meters away through what had been, 2 weeks earlier, a network of streets. The streets were no longer there. What lay between the 2 bunkers now was a country of rubble, sloping piles of brick and twisted iron, collapsed walls leaning against each other at uncertain angles, small fires that had not yet finished burning, and beneath all of it, the dust of the buildings that the dust had once been. Aaron knew the route by memory. The route had ceased to exist 3 days ago. He moved by night, although it was only afternoon. The smoke was thick enough that the light at street level was the color of late dusk, and the German patrols had begun to confine themselves to the perimeter, and the interior of the burning quarter belonged, for several hours each afternoon, to whoever was willing to move through it. Few were willing. Aaron had been chosen because he was small and quick, and because he had grown up in these streets and had played, as a child, in the courtyards that no longer existed. He did not arrive at the brushmaker's bunker. The observer notes this without preamble, because preamble would not change what had happened. Aaron crossed the rubble of what had been Świętojerska Street, and he turned south at the place where a particular bakery had stood, and he passed beneath the leaning wall of a building whose upper floors had collapsed into its lower floors, and he was perhaps 80 meters from the entrance to the brushmaker's bunker when the wall above him gave way. He died quickly. The observer does not describe the moment. The 3 folded sheets of paper inside the lining of his shoe were buried with him under perhaps 2 meters of brick, and they would not be recovered, and the orders they contained, orders for the coordination of the next morning's defensive positions, orders that the brushmaker's bunker had been waiting to receive for 2 days, would not arrive. The brushmaker's bunker, by midnight, would conclude that the command on Miła Street had fallen. It had not. But the conclusion would be acted upon. Mordecai had sent 4 messengers in the previous 3 days. 2 had returned. Aaron was the third. The fourth, a young woman called Rachel, had left 2 hours earlier with messages for a different bunker on Miła Street, and her return was expected before nightfall, and she would not return either. The cause in her case would be different. The cause would not matter. By 6 in the evening, Mordecai was standing at the map on the wall of the command room, and he was looking at marks that no longer corresponded to anything verifiable. The bunkers were marked in red. Most of them, he believed, were still occupied. Some of them, he could no longer be sure. 2 of the marks he had drawn an X through that afternoon, after receiving confirmed reports of their loss. 3 more he was uncertain about. The map had begun to be a record of his own ignorance. Xivia entered the command room. She had been at the chamber of the wounded, the small room they continued to call the infirmary, although the people in it were no longer being treated, only kept, and she came to report that one of the older men had died, and that 2 more would not survive the night. She made the report quietly. Mordecai listened without turning from the map. When she had finished, he asked whether Aaron had returned. She said no. He nodded. He continued to look at the map. She waited at the doorway for a moment, and then she turned and left, because there was nothing further to say, and because Mordecai required, as he always did, the particular silence in which decisions arranged themselves inside him. What he was deciding, that evening, was a question of communication. The Jewish Combat Organization had begun the operation as a network. The bunkers had been linked by tunnels where the geography permitted, and by messengers where it did not, and by a system of agreed signals, 3 knocks on a particular pipe, a chalk mark on a particular wall, a phrase spoken in a particular order, that allowed any single bunker to know, within hours, what was happening in any other. That network had begun to break in the first days of the operation. By the second week, it had broken in many places. By this evening, the 28th of April, it was no longer possible to speak of a network at all. What remained was a scattering of small commands, each of them holding its own ground, each of them increasingly uncertain whether the others still existed. Mordecai understood this. He had understood it for some days. What he had not yet decided was whether to formalize the understanding. To formalize it would mean issuing an order. The order would be brief. It would say that each bunker was henceforth to act on its own authority, in its own judgment, until further coordination was possible. It would say that the central command, while it continued to exist, could no longer guarantee the synchronization of actions across positions, and that the local commanders were authorized to decide all questions of defense, withdrawal, and contact with civilians on their own. It would be in effect the dissolution of the organization as a single body. The organization would continue to exist, but it would exist as a constellation, not as a structure. Mordecai stood at the map and weighed the order. To issue it would acknowledge what was already true. To withhold it would preserve, for some additional days, the appearance of central authority, and the appearance, he understood, was not nothing. The fighters in the outlying bunkers were holding their positions partly because they believed that someone, somewhere, was holding them in a larger pattern. If he removed that belief, he did not know what they would hold. He stood at the map for perhaps an hour. He did not issue the order. He sat down at the table. He took out the small piece of paper from the lining of his jacket and he unfolded it. The sentence had grown to 6 lines now. He had been adding to it, in fragments, for 5 days. The lines did not yet cohere into a single thought. They were, he understood, 6 attempts at a single thought that he had not yet found the right shape for. He read what he had written. He crossed out one word and replaced it with another. He folded the paper and returned it to his jacket. In a tunnel beneath what had been Miła Street, Rachel, the fourth messenger, was lying very still in the dark and listening to footsteps above her. She had taken a wrong turn at a junction perhaps 10 minutes earlier, and the wrong turn had brought her into a section of tunnel that ran directly beneath an active German position, and she had heard the footsteps, and she had stopped and pressed herself against the wall of the tunnel, and she had not moved since. She had been standing in the dark, in cold water up to her ankles, for perhaps 40 minutes. She was still alive. She would remain alive for several more hours. What would happen to her after that? The observer chooses not to describe, because the description would add nothing to what is already understood, and because Rachel, who had crossed the wall 5 times in the previous 2 months, who had carried weapons in the false bottom of a school satchel, who had once stood in a doorway on Miła Street and told a German officer her name was Maria, and watched him believe her, Rachel deserves, at this point in the telling, the small dignity of being remembered as a young woman standing in cold water in the dark, listening, alive. The bunker on Miła Street, by morning, would conclude that she was not coming. They would be correct, although the cause they assumed would be wrong. Across the rubble, in 3 other bunkers that had received no communication from Miła Street in 2 days, similar conclusions were being formed. The fighters in those bunkers were not yet acting on the conclusions. They were like Mordecai at his map, weighing the appearance against the truth, and finding the appearance still useful. The appearance would not last much longer. By midnight on the 28th, the watchmaker, sitting at his small table near the kitchen, had completed his evening counts. He had counted the bullets remaining in the bunker. He had counted the liters of water in the barrel. He had counted the breaths in the chamber, although he no longer wrote that number down. The chamber held 31 people now, some of them barely breathing, and the count had become a private ritual that he performed for reasons he no longer needed to explain to himself. In his 3rd notebook, he wrote one line. He wrote that the air in the bunker had begun to taste different. He did not specify how. He did not know yet how to specify. Above ground, on the Aryan side of the wall, the tram bell rang at the corner of Bonifraterska, the last run of the night, the small mechanical sound that had returned to the city 3 days earlier, and was now once again, as it had always been, part of the geometry of an ordinary evening. Mordecai, in the command room, did not hear it. The watchmaker, in the kitchen chamber, did not hear it either. The air shafts had been closed further that afternoon, after the wind had shifted again, and the small sound from the world above no longer reached them. Aaron was buried under the leaning wall on Świętojerska Street. Rachel was standing in cold water in the tunnel beneath Miła. 3 folded sheets of paper and a memorized sequence of 3 sentences would not arrive at the bunkers they had been intended for. The map on the wall of the command room continued to show a network. The network had become a fiction. The fiction was being maintained by silent agreement on both sides of every bunker wall, because the alternative, to stop maintaining it, was a thing that no one had yet found the strength to do. The dog stopped at the corner of Miła and Zamenhof at 9:15 in the morning, and the man holding the leash did not at first understand why. The dog was an Alsatian, 4 years old, trained by a kennel in Bavaria for the location of human concealment in collapsed structures. She had been in Warsaw for 11 days. She had located, in that time, 14 bunker entrances. She did not know the word bunker. She knew a particular configuration of scents, the warm respiration of bodies, the smell of tallow and unwashed clothing, and the slow chemistry of human breath rising through narrow openings in the earth. And she had been rewarded, each time she found this configuration, with a piece of dried meat from her handler's pocket. She stopped at the corner because the configuration was here. Strongly. Coming from somewhere beneath the rubble of a collapsed tenement, perhaps 2 meters to her left. Herr Händler watched her for a moment. He was a young Untersturmführer, 24 years old, who had not yet developed the practical instincts that older handlers possessed. He had been told that the dogs were to be trusted absolutely, and he trusted his absolutely, and when she sat down, which was the gesture she had been trained to make when the configuration was confirmed, he reached for the radio at his belt. He spoke into the radio. He gave the coordinates. Within 20 minutes, 3 teams had assembled at the corner. A team of engineers with listening equipment. A team of soldiers with grenades and gas canisters. A team of laborers, Polish workers requisitioned for the task of clearing rubble, who were instructed to begin the careful removal of the brick and timber that lay between the surface and the entrance below. The work began at 10 in the morning. By 11, the engineers had identified the location of the air shaft. By 11:30, they had identified 2 more. By noon, they had drilled a small exploratory hole through the rubble and had lowered a microphone, and the man with the earpieces had listened for some time and then nodded slowly to the team commander and had said, in a voice quieter than was strictly necessary, that there were many. The team commander did not ask how many. The number, beyond a certain point, did not change the procedure. Inside the bunker on Miła Street, the watchmaker had heard the first sounds of the digging at 10:15. He had been at his small table near the kitchen. The sounds had reached him as a faint, intermittent vibration through the earth above the ceiling of the chamber, and he had stopped writing in his 3rd notebook, and had sat very still and had listened for some time before he had stood and walked to the command room. Mordecai was at the map. He had been at the map for most of the previous night. The watchmaker did not need to speak. Mordecai understood from the way the watchmaker was standing in the doorway, and the watchmaker confirmed it with a single small nod. And Mordecai turned from the map and walked to the foot of the ladder and climbed it and stood for some time at the trapdoor, listening to the sounds from above through the small gap that the trapdoor allowed. He came back down. He called for Zivia. He called for the 3 remaining commanders. The meeting began at 20 minutes to 11. The meeting was brief. Mordecai did not speak much. He outlined what he believed was happening above them, and he asked for the commanders' assessments of the time available, and he listened to their answers, and he made certain decisions, and he gave certain orders, and the meeting ended at 1 minute past 11, 21 minutes after it had begun. The orders were these. The wounded would be moved to the deepest chamber, where the air would last the longest. The fighters would take positions at the 2 main exits, with weapons drawn. The civilians would be assembled in the main chamber and would be addressed by Zivia, who would explain the situation in such terms as could be explained. The watchmaker would remain near the air shafts, prepared to close them fully if gas began to enter. Mordecai himself would remain in the command room until further information arrived. The orders were carried out without protest. The bunker had been preparing for this morning, in an unspoken way, since the operation began. Each person knew what was being asked of them. The carrying out had a quality of practiced silence that Mordecai had not foreseen and did not, in the moment, allow himself to feel. Above ground, the digging continued. By 1 in the afternoon, the labourers had cleared the rubble down to the original surface of the courtyard. The trapdoor, disguised as a section of paving stones, hinged on one side, weighted on the other, was visible. The German team commander did not order it opened. Opening it would have invited the kind of fire that had killed soldiers in the early days of the operation, and the lessons of those days had been learnt. What he ordered instead was the deployment of the gas. The canisters were lowered through the air shafts. 3 of the shafts had been located by the engineers. The watchmaker, in the chamber below, had identified the same 3. When the first canister began to release its contents, a cyanide-based compound that German military doctrine had selected for its rapid effect in confined spaces, the watchmaker was already at the first shaft, with a thick wad of damp cloth in his hands. He sealed the shaft. He moved to the second. He sealed it. He moved to the third. He sealed it. The bunker was now closed. What this meant, the watchmaker understood with a precision that came from 42 years of having understood, in his small mechanical way, exactly how systems worked. The bunker held perhaps 90 cubic meters of breathable air. There were 120 people inside it. The gas had not been admitted. The choice that remained was one of duration only. He went to find Mordecai. Mordecai was in the command room. He was sitting at the table. The small piece of paper from the lining of his jacket was open in front of him, and he had a pencil in his hand, and he had written, in the previous 20 minutes, 3 more lines. The watchmaker stood at the doorway. He did not need to speak. Mordecai looked up. The 2 men looked at each other for some seconds. Then Mordecai folded the paper. He placed it back inside the lining of his jacket. He stood. He walked past the watchmaker and went into the main chamber, where Xavier was finishing her address to the civilians, and he stood at the back of the room and he listened to the end of what she was saying. And when she had finished, he came forward and he spoke briefly himself. The observer does not record what he said. The words were heard by approximately 80 people, several of whom would survive the war, none of whom would ever describe them in writing. What is known is that he spoke for less than 2 minutes. What is known is that no one in the chamber wept while he spoke. What is known is that when he finished, a young woman near the front began to sing very softly, a song that the watchmaker recognized as one his mother had sung in his childhood, and that the others in the chamber joined the singing one by one until the room was full of a sound that was not loud and was not weeping and was not exactly song, but was something the language has not yet built a word for. What followed? The observer chooses to describe in fragments only. Not from delicacy. From accuracy. What followed cannot be told in continuous prose, because it did not happen as continuous prose. It happened in moments, in gestures, in the small, careful arrangements that human beings make when they are deciding the manner of something that has already been decided. A man tied his shoe. He had not bothered to tie it for many days. He tied it carefully, with a double knot. A woman covered the face of another woman. The face was that of a child. The child had already gone. A young man in the corner of the chamber wrote his name on the wall with a piece of charcoal. He wrote it slowly, in large letters, so that anyone who came afterwards would be able to read it. Beneath his name, he wrote the date. Beneath the date, he wrote nothing further. The watchmaker went to his small table near the kitchen. He opened his third notebook to a clean page. He wrote one sentence. He wrote that he had counted, that morning, 18 breaths in his chamber. The number had returned to what it had been at the beginning. He did not know whether to record this as a fact or as a conclusion. He closed the notebook. He placed it on the table. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the cover. Mordecai Anilevich died in the bunker on Miła Street on the 8th of May, 1943. He was 23 years old. The exact circumstances of his death are uncertain. Some accounts say he died with the others. Some say he chose his own moment. Some say his body was never found, and that the uncertainty itself became, in the years that followed, a kind of monument. The observer does not select among the accounts. The selection would be a small additional violence. What is certain is that the small folded paper in the lining of his jacket was never recovered. The sentence that had grown to 9 lines over the previous 15 days was lost in the rubble of the bunker, and what remained of it survived only in the memory of Yitzhak Zuckerman on the Aryan side of the wall, who had received fragments of it in earlier letters, and who would, decades later, attempt to reconstruct the whole from those fragments. The reconstruction would be incomplete. Some of the lines would be missing. The bunker on Miła Street was sealed by the Germans on the 9th of May. The team that had located it moved on to the next position. By that evening, the dog at the corner of Miła and Zamenhofer had been rewarded with a piece of dried meat and was already at work 3 streets away, where another configuration of scent had been detected beneath another collapse. Above the city, the smoke continued to rise. On the Aryan side of the wall, the tram bell rang at the corner of Bonifraterska, line 17, the 11 o'clock service, full of passengers returning from the center of the city. The bell carried over the wall, into the burning quarter, into the rubble of streets that no longer existed, and faintly, very faintly, into the sealed chamber where the watchmaker had set down his notebook, and where no one was listening any longer. The man who came to the door of the room above the tailor's shop was not anyone Zuckerman had seen before, and he had no name to give, and he asked permission to come inside in a voice that carried the particular flatness of someone who had been speaking for several days only what was necessary. Zuckerman let him in. He closed the door behind him. He gestured to the small wooden chair beside the desk, and the man sat down, and Zuckerman sat across from him on the edge of the bed and waited. The man did not speak for some time. He had emerged from the sewers at 4 in the morning 2 days earlier, through a manhole cover behind a tenement on Franciszkańska Street, the same courtyard that Simcha and his group had emerged into, the courtyard where no one had been waiting. This man had been waited for by an arrangement different from the one that had failed Simcha. The arrangement had held. He had been received, dried, fed a small bowl of soup he had not been able to finish, and he had slept for 31 hours in a room behind a bookshop on Świętokrzyska, and he had been brought to Zuckerman that morning by a Polish woman who had not given her name either. The woman was now downstairs, waiting in the entrance of the tailor's shop, watching the street. Zuckerman did not press. He had learned, in the previous month, that men and women who had crossed under the wall arrived with a particular weight inside them, and that the weight required time to settle before words could be arranged around it. He waited. The man cleared his throat eventually. He said his name. Zuckerman recognized it. He had been a fighter in the bunker on Miła Street. He had escaped, the man explained, through the secondary tunnel that connected the Miła bunker to the bunker on the next street. He had escaped on the morning of the 8th of May. He had been one of perhaps 12 who had made it through. He did not know how many of those 12 had survived the days that followed. He was the only one who had reached the Aryan side. Zuckerman did not interrupt. He understood, from the order in which the man was placing his sentences, that the principal information had not yet been delivered. The man was building his way toward it. The man required this. It was perhaps 11 minutes before he arrived. Mordecai was dead. The man said it as a single sentence, with no elaboration. And then he stopped speaking and looked down at his hands, which were resting on his knees, and he sat without moving for some seconds. Zuckerman did not speak. He did not move. He sat on the edge of the bed, with his hands resting on his thighs, and he looked at the man, and he did not understand, in the first second, what he had just been told. The understanding arrived in the second, and the second after that, and continued to arrive, in small successive waves, for the remainder of the conversation and for many hours afterwards. Some kinds of information do not finish arriving for years. The man continued. He explained, in fragments, what had happened in the bunker. The dog at the corner. The drilled holes. The canisters lowered through the air shafts. The watchmaker who had sealed the shafts and bought them by his sealing the small additional time in which the rest had been arranged. He explained that Mordecai had spoken to the civilians in the main chamber. He could not remember what Mordecai had said. He had been at one of the exits, with a weapon, and the words had reached him as a presence rather than as language, and he had not retained them. He apologized for not having retained them. Zuckerman did not respond to the apology. The man explained that he had taken nothing from the bunker. No documents. No personal effects of those who had remained. The escape through the secondary tunnel had been chaotic, and what had been carried only inside the bodies of those who had escaped. He understood that this was a loss. He apologized for it. Zuckerman did not respond to this apology either. He had not yet found the use of his voice. The man said one more thing. He said that he had been in the command room briefly, perhaps 2 hours before the end. He had seen Mordecai sitting at the table. Mordecai had been writing something on a small piece of paper. The man had glanced at the paper without intending to, as he had passed behind Mordecai on his way to the corridor. He had seen briefly, perhaps 3 or 4 lines. He could not remember them exactly. He had read them in passing, in low light, while moving. But he believed he could remember some of the phrases. He could give Zuckerman, if Zuckerman wanted, what he could. Zuckerman, at last, found the use of his voice. He said yes. The man closed his eyes. He sat for some time in concentration. Then he began to recite, slowly, with pauses between fragments, what he believed he had seen. The dream of my life has come true. I have lived to see Jewish self-defense in the ghetto rise to its full strength. Then a phrase the man could not recover. Something about the impossible. Something about what had been thought impossible. Then another phrase. Be well, my friend. Then nothing more. The man opened his eyes. He apologized again, this time for the gaps. He had read the lines for perhaps 3 seconds. He had not known he was reading something that would matter. Zuckerman thanked him. The thanking took a particular form. Zuckerman did not say the word thank you. He nodded once, slowly, and he held the nod for perhaps 2 seconds, and the man across from him understood the gesture and accepted it, and the two of them sat for some additional minutes in the small room above the tailor's shop without speaking, and outside, in the street below, a delivery cart passed, and a woman called to a child in Polish, and the city continued. The man rose eventually. He said he would have to leave before nightfall. Arrangements had been made for him. He could not stay in the same place for more than 1 day. Zuckerman stood. He walked the man to the door. He shook the man's hand briefly. He did not embrace him, although both men, in different ways, would later think that he should have. The man left. Zuckerman closed the door. He stood for some time in the center of the room. Then he went to the small desk near the window. He sat down. He took out a sheet of paper. He took out a pen. He wrote, at the top of the page, the date. The 11th of May, 1943. Beneath the date he wrote, in careful capital letters, the name. Mordecai Anilevich. Beneath the name, he wrote what he had been told. The phrases the man had recited. He left blank lines where the man had been unable to remember, because he understood that the gaps were part of what he had been given, and that to fill them in himself would be a kind of theft from the dead. The dream of my life has come true. I have lived to see Jewish self-defense in the ghetto rise to its full strength. 3 blank lines. Be well, my friend. He looked at the page for a long time. The blank lines were, he understood, the part of the letter that mattered most, and the part he would never, for the remainder of his long life, be able to fill in. Mordecai had written the letter on the 23rd of April. The paper recovered by the man in the bunker had been a continuation, written in the days that followed, of something that had originally been sent through a courier on the night the dream sentence first appeared. Zuckerman had received the original. He had read the dream sentence 18 days ago. He had, in the days since, read it many more times. What Mordecai had written in the bunker, in the fragments now lost, had been the second half. The half that explained, the half that placed the dream sentence in its proper meaning. Without it, the first sentence stood alone, and would stand alone for decades, and would be read by people who would interpret it variously, who would project onto it their own understandings of resistance and defeat and redemption, who would not know that there had been more, and that the more had been buried in the rubble of a chamber on Miła Street. Zuckerman folded the page he had written. He placed it inside a book on the desk. The book was a German edition of Heine's poems that had belonged to a friend who had been killed in 1939. He did not know why he placed the page there, except that the book had been with him through everything, and that to put the page anywhere else would have been to admit, somehow, that the page belonged to a different category of object than the things he could still hold. He stood. He went to the window. The smoke had begun to thin in the previous days. The ghetto had stopped burning, in the way fires stop burning when there is nothing further to consume, and what remained above the wall was a paler, slower smoke that rose only intermittently from spots where embers still found something to take. The horizon to the east was clearer than it had been for 3 weeks. From the corner of Bonifraterska, the tram bell rang. Line 17, the afternoon service, full of passengers. The bell carried clearly through the spring air. Zuckerman stood at the window and listened to the bell, and he thought of Mordecai, who had heard this same sound from the other side of the wall for many months, and who would not hear it again. He thought of the watchmaker, whose name he did not know, who had sealed the air shafts. He thought of the 80 people in the chamber, and of the song they had sung, and of the fragments of the letter that he would carry, in the book on the desk behind him, for the next 45 years. He did not weep. Not yet. Weeping would come, in the months and the years that followed, in waves and at intervals he would not anticipate. But not at this window. Not on this afternoon. He turned from the window. He went back to the desk. He opened the book. He took out the folded page. He read it once more. Then he placed it back inside the book, and he closed the book, and he sat with his hands resting on the cover for some time in the small room above the tailor's shop on the 11th of May, 1943, with the spring afternoon outside, and the city continuing, and the bell of line 17 ringing again, faintly, at the corner of Bonifraterska, in a world that had become, in the previous hour, a place from which one specific sound was now permanently absent. The sound of Mordecai's voice. The world would continue. It would not contain that sound again. The five of them had been in the building on Franciszkańska Street for 4 days, and on the morning of the 5th day they understood, without any of them having said it, that this would be the last day. The building was no longer a building in any meaningful sense. Its upper floors had collapsed in the second week of the operation, and what remained was a wedge of brick and beam, perhaps 2 stories at the rear, where the structure had folded onto itself in a way that left small pockets of intact space, and nothing at the front, where the facade had dissolved entirely into the street. The 5 fighters had found their way into the rear pockets through a passage that had once been a coal chute, and they had reinforced the pockets from within, and they had brought with them 3 pistols, 1 rifle, 11 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, and a small canvas bag containing what was left of their food. The food had been finished on the 3rd day. It was the 3rd of May, 1943. Mordecai was still alive, though they did not know this, and would not know it, before they themselves were no longer alive to know anything. The communications between bunkers had failed entirely 2 days earlier. What each pocket of fighters now knew about the larger situation came from what they could observe through the small gaps in their walls, and from the patterns of German movement in the streets above them, and from the silences that had begun to gather in places where, days before, there had been the sounds of other resistance. They were Blumer, Heniek, Tadek, Estera, and the girl. The girl had no name. She had given one when she had joined the group, 6 days earlier, but the name had not been her own. She had taken the name of a friend who had died in March, and she had taken it without consultation, and the others had used it without questioning, and on the 2nd day she had withdrawn the name and asked them to call her nothing. They had agreed. She was perhaps 16. She might have been younger. She did not say. Blumer was the eldest, at 31. She had been a nurse at the Jewish hospital. Heniek was 28, a printer, who had spent the previous winter producing the small clandestine newspaper that had circulated in the upper bunkers. Tadek was 24, very thin, who had not slept properly in 9 days, and whose hands had begun to shake in a way he could no longer hide. Estera was 20. The youngest after the girl, and she had been engaged before the war to a young rabbi who had been taken in August. These were the people in the building on Franciszkańska Street on the morning of the 3rd of May. They had heard German voices in the street outside since the previous afternoon. A small unit had been searching the rubble of the block, and had passed near their pockets several times, and had not yet found the passage through the coal chute. The 5 fighters had been taking turns at the small gap that served as their observation post, and they had been counting the number of soldiers, the kind of equipment, the rotation of the guards. By midday, they had stopped counting. The Germans had brought up dogs. Blumer was at the gap when the first dog was led to the corner of the building. She watched it cast back and forth across the rubble. She watched it pause. She watched it sit down, in the gesture that the dogs were trained to make. She did not move from the gap. She continued to watch. The Germans began to clear the rubble at 1 in the afternoon. They worked methodically, with the same Polish laborers who had been used in the previous bunker discoveries, and they cleared toward the entrance of the coal chute, with the slow patience of men who had done this work many times, and who knew that haste produced no faster result. Inside the pocket, the 5 fighters held a brief discussion. The discussion lasted perhaps 4 minutes. The terms of the discussion were these. The Germans, when they reached the chute, would not enter. They had stopped entering bunkers some time ago. They would lower gas or grenades or both. The 5 fighters had 11 rounds of ammunition. They had 2 grenades. They had no possibility of escape. The question before them was whether to wait for the Germans to deliver what was coming or to choose the moment themselves. 3 of them argued for waiting. Bloomer, Henrik, the girl. Each had a different reason. Bloomer believed that the longer they delayed the Germans, the more time other fighters elsewhere would have. Henrik believed that he wanted to fire the rifle at least once at a target he could see. The girl did not give a reason. She said only that she preferred to wait. 2 argued for choosing. Tadek, whose hands had been shaking for 9 days. Estera, who said softly that she had been thinking in the previous hours about a young rabbi, and that she did not wish to die in a way that would have shamed him. The discussion did not arrive at a single decision. It arrived instead at an agreement that each of them would do as they wished, and that no one would judge anyone else, and that the moment, when it came, would not be a moment of disagreement among them. They embraced, briefly, each of the 5 with each of the others. The embraces were not long. They were the brief, firm embraces of people who had spent 4 days together in a small dark space, and who had become, in that space, the last family any of them would have. Then they took their positions. Henrik went to the gap with the rifle. Bloomer stood beside him with one of the pistols. The girl took the second pistol and sat with her back to the rear wall of the pocket, facing the entrance to the coal chute, with the third pistol on the floor beside her. Tadek and Estera moved to the rear of the pocket, where the ceiling was lowest, and they sat down side by side, and they took the 2 grenades from the canvas bag. Estera asked Tadek, quietly, whether he wanted her to do it. Tadek said no. He said his hands had stopped shaking. This was true. His hands had stopped shaking the moment the discussion had ended. He did not understand why. He did not need to understand. Outside, the rubble continued to be cleared. At 20 minutes to 2, the Polish laborers reached the entrance to the coal chute. The German team commander ordered them back. He sent forward 2 of his soldiers with a bag of equipment. The soldiers approached the chute slowly. They did not speak to each other. From the gap, Henrik could see them clearly. He had the rifle raised. His finger was on the trigger. Bloomer stood beside him, the pistol held in both hands. Henrik waited until the soldiers were at the chute. He fired once. The first soldier fell. The observer does not describe what followed in continuous prose. The events did not happen in continuous time. They happened in a rapid succession of small, irreducible facts, each of which the observer notes only because each was a fact, and because the noting is what survives. Henrik fired 3 times. Bloomer fired twice. The Germans returned fire into the gap with their rifles. Henrik was hit in the shoulder. Bloomer was hit in the chest. The girl, at the rear wall, did not raise her pistol. She had said she preferred to wait. She was waiting. Tadek pulled the pin from the first grenade. Estera placed her hand briefly on his hand. Then she released his hand. Then he closed his fist around the grenade. The grenade went off in his hand. Estera was beside him. 3 of the 5 were dead. Bloomer was on the floor of the pocket. She was alive, but would not remain so. Henrik was beside her, also on the floor, holding his shoulder, his rifle lost. The girl was at the rear wall. The Germans, at the entrance to the chute, did not advance. They had heard the grenade. They were waiting now, as they had been trained to wait, for the bunker to declare itself finished. Henrik looked at the girl. She looked at him. He understood in the look what she had decided. She raised the pistol. She did not point it at the chute. The observer does not describe the sound. The sound is not the point. The point is that she had said she preferred to wait, and that the waiting had been her choice, and that what had followed her waiting had also been her choice, and that the dignity of the choice belongs to her and not to the description of it. Henrik was the last. He sat against the wall of the pocket for some additional minutes. Bloomer had stopped breathing at some point in the previous minute, although he had not noticed exactly when. He held the second grenade in his good hand. He did not pull the pin yet. He thought for a moment of his small print shop on Miła Street, of a particular afternoon in the autumn of 1939, before the wall had been built, before any of this had begun, when he had set the type for a small advertisement for a wedding, and the bride had come into the shop to check the proof, and she had laughed at a small mistake he had made, and he had corrected the mistake and reprinted the proof and given her a discount because of the laughing. He did not remember the bride's name. He hoped, briefly, that she had survived. He had no way of knowing. He pulled the pin. The 5 fighters in the building on Franciszkanska Street were dead by 10 minutes past, 2 on the afternoon of the 3rd of May, 1943. The German team commander noted the time in his pocketbook. He recorded the resistance as light. He moved his unit to the next collapsed structure, 2 streets to the south. The bodies were not removed. They remained in the pocket of the building on Franciszkanska Street for the next 31 years, until the foundations of a new apartment block were excavated in 1974, and the workmen, in the course of clearing the deepest section of the site, found the remains of 5 people in a small space at the rear of what had once been a cellar. The remains were buried, with appropriate ceremony, in a section of the Jewish cemetery on Uprising Street. Their names were not known to the workmen who had found them. 3 of the 5 names have since been recovered, through the work of historians who pieced together the records of the bunkers in that quarter. 2 of the names have not been recovered. One of those 2 is the girl who said she preferred to wait. Above the city, on the Aryan side, the tram bell rang at the corner of Bonifraterska. Line 17, the 2 o'clock service. The driver was the same man. He rang the bell. He did not look at the wall. He had not looked at it for many weeks now, and he would, he understood, never look at it again. The bell carried clearly through the spring afternoon. It carried over the wall, into the burning quarter, into the rubble of streets that no longer existed, and into the small pocket of a collapsed building on Franciszkanska Street, where 5 people had become, in the previous 24 minutes, a fact that would wait 31 years to be discovered. The pocket was silent now. The bell carried into the silence and was not received. The great synagogue at Tłomacki Square stood at the edge of what had once been the ghetto, and on the evening of the 16th of May 1943, it was the last large structure of the Warsaw that had existed before the war that remained intact. It had been built in 1878. It had a dome of green copper that could be seen from the Vistula. It had been designed by an architect who had wanted, in his own modest words, to give the Jews of Warsaw a building that would not be embarrassed in any company. Stroop arrived at Tłomacki Square at 7:15 in the evening. He was wearing his dress uniform. He had ordered this. He had also ordered that a small group of officers be present, that a photographer be present, that the demolition charges be set with particular care, and that the ceremony, for he understood it as a ceremony, although he had not used the word in any written order, begin precisely at 8:15. The synagogue was outside the official boundary of the ghetto. It was technically on the Aryan side. Stroop had requested permission several days earlier to include it in the operation. The permission had been granted by Krakow within 4 hours. The reasoning given was operational. The reasoning understood by everyone involved was something else. The charges had been laid by an engineering team beginning at noon. They had worked through the afternoon. They had placed explosives at the four corners of the foundation, and at the central pillars supporting the dome, and at the base of the bema where the Torah scrolls had been read for 65 years. The scrolls themselves had been removed by the Germans some weeks earlier, and had not been seen since. The interior of the synagogue, by the time the charges were laid, was empty. Stroop walked once around the building. He did not enter it. He stood for some time at the base of the eastern wall, looking up at the windows, which had been boarded over months earlier, and which now showed only flat wooden surfaces against the brick. He thought, although he did not write this, that the building was larger than he had expected. Photographs had not prepared him for the actual scale. He returned to the small group of officers who had assembled at the southern edge of the square. He nodded to the photographer. The photographer adjusted his tripod. At 8 in the evening, Stroop accepted a small glass of brandy from one of his deputies. He drank it in 2 sips. He returned the glass. At 8:10, he was handed the detonator. The detonator was a small wooden box with a handle on top. It had been designed for civilian engineering work, for the demolition of old factory chimneys, for the clearing of obstructions in mining operations, and it had not been designed for what Stroop was about to use it for. He held it in both hands. He waited for the second hand of his pocket watch to align. At precisely 20 minutes and 0 seconds past 8, he pressed the handle. The synagogue did not collapse immediately. It rose, very slightly, in the way that large structures rise when their foundations have been removed beneath them, and for perhaps half a second it hung in the air, as if uncertain what to do with the new condition of its existence. Then it folded inward. The dome came down first, in a single piece, and the walls followed, and the columns at the eastern end fell last, into the dust that had begun to rise from the center of the building. The sound reached Stroop perhaps half a second after the visible collapse. It was lower than he had expected. A great deep concussion that was felt in the chest more than heard in the ears, followed by the long secondary sound of brick striking brick as the structure continued to fall into itself. Then silence. Then the sound of the dust. The dust rose in a pillar that climbed for perhaps 30 seconds before the wind began to take it, and then it spread westward across Twamaki Square, and then across the streets beyond, settling in fine grey layers on the windowsills and on the parked cars and on the shoulders of the few pedestrians who had stopped in the surrounding streets to watch. Stroop watched the dust for some time. He turned eventually to the small group of officers behind him. He did not speak to them at first. He took out a small leather notebook from the inside pocket of his uniform, and he wrote in it, in pencil, in his careful, slightly leaning hand, a single sentence. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no longer in existence. He read the sentence to himself. He underlined the word "no longer." He returned the notebook to his pocket. Then he turned to his deputy and he said, in a voice that was meant to be heard by the others present, that the operation was concluded. He said it with a precision he had been preparing for several hours. The photograph was taken at that moment. Stroop's face in the photograph is calm. His hands are at his sides. The dust from the synagogue has begun to settle on his shoulders. The photograph would survive. It would be entered into evidence at Nuremberg in 1947. The leather book would also be entered, with its careful entries, including the sentence written that evening in pencil. Stroop would be hanged in Warsaw in 1952. The hanging would be carried out at Mokotów prison on a specific morning, and would be witnessed by a small number of officials, and would be reported briefly in the Polish press. None of this is the subject of this telling. The subject of this telling is what happened on the tram. At 22 minutes past 8, Line 17 passed along Bonifraterska on its evening run. The tram was not full. Perhaps 14 passengers, returning from late shifts at the center of the city, or going to visit relatives in Żoliborz. The driver was the same man who had driven the route for 19 years, who had stopped looking at the wall some weeks ago, who had told himself that he would never look at it again. He saw the dust before he heard about the cause. It was visible above the roof lines as he turned onto Bonifraterska, a column of paler grey rising from somewhere southwest of the route, drifting slowly across the evening sky. He noticed it. He did not know what it was. He continued the route. Inside the tram, the passengers had also seen the dust. Two of them, an older woman in a grey coat, a young man with a small leather case, had moved to the windows on the right side of the tram for a better view. They watched the column for some seconds. They did not speak. The young man, after a moment, turned his head away. He looked instead at his own reflection in the window opposite him, faintly visible against the dark interior of the tram. He looked at his reflection for the rest of the journey. The older woman in the grey coat continued to watch the column. She watched it for nearly 2 minutes. She did not speak to anyone. When the tram pulled to a stop at the corner of Krasinski Square, the same square where 3 weeks earlier the carousel had turned through Easter Sunday, she stepped down and she stood for some additional time on the pavement, looking back at the column of dust that was now thinning against the evening sky. She was perhaps 60 years old. She was Polish. She had lived in this district her entire life. She had walked past the synagogue at Tłomaki many hundreds of times in her childhood, on her way to a school several streets to the east, and she had once, at the age of 9, gone inside it on a Saturday morning by mistake, having confused it with a different building, and she had been gently asked to leave by a man with a long white beard who had given her, before she left, a small piece of fruit from his coat pocket. She remembered this. She remembered it standing on the pavement at Krasinski Square, watching the dust. She had not thought about it for many years. She did not know why it had returned to her now. She stood for some additional minutes. Then she turned and walked toward her home, 3 streets to the west, and she did not look back at the dust again. The tram continued its route. The bell rang at the corner of Bonifraterska. The driver did not look at the wall. He had decided some weeks ago that he would not look at it again, and he had kept this decision, and he kept it now. The dust from the synagogue continued to settle across Warsaw for the rest of the evening. By midnight, it had reached the windowsills of apartments 2 kilometers from Tłomaki Square. The grandmother in the apartment above Krasinski Square, the one who had brought her granddaughter to the carousel, found a fine grey film on her kitchen window the following morning. She wiped it off with a damp cloth. She thought it was ash from a chimney. She did not investigate. In the small room above the tailor's shop on Marszałkowska, Yitzhak Zuckerman had heard the explosion. He had been sitting at the small desk near the window, working on a letter he was writing to a contact in the Polish underground, and the deep concussion had reached him through the walls of the building, and he had risen and gone to the window, and he had seen the column of dust rising in the southeast, and he had understood at once what it meant. He stood at the window for a long time. He did not write anything in his letter that evening. He folded the unfinished page and placed it inside the same book where, 5 days earlier, he had placed the reconstruction of the fragments of Mordecai's letter. The book of Heine's poems. The 2 pages now lay together, separated only by a few thin sheets of 19th century verse. He returned to the window. He listened. The tram bell rang at Bonifraterska. The sound was the same as it had always been. The mechanical small note, the indifferent small note, the note that had structured the days of every Jewish person inside the wall for 2.5 years. The wall, by the following morning, would no longer exist as a wall. Stroop had ordered the demolition of the gates and of the larger sections that had defined the perimeter, although the project would take weeks to complete. The bell would continue to ring. The line would continue to run. The driver would continue to drive. What would change was the nature of the silence on the other side. It had been for 2.5 years the silence of a place where people lived who were forbidden from speaking. It would now become, for the first time, the silence of a place where no one lived at all. Stroop's sentence in the leather book had not been true when he wrote it. Many people were still alive in the rubble. Many people would survive in the sewers and in the cellars and in the spaces beneath collapsed buildings for weeks and months to come. The sentence was a lie at the moment of its writing. The lie would be quoted in textbooks and museums and documentaries for the next 80 years. It would become more famous than the truth. The Polish woman in the grey coat reached her apartment shortly before 9. She did not turn on the light. She sat for some time in the dark of her front room, and she thought again of the man with the long white beard who had given her the small piece of fruit when she was 9 years old, and she did not know what to do with the memory, and she sat with it until she was ready to stand and to go to bed. The fruit, she remembered now, had been a plum. She had not eaten it. She had brought it home and shown it to her mother. Her mother had washed it and cut it in half, and they had shared it. The plum had been very ripe. The juice had stained the cloth on the kitchen table. The stain had remained for many years. The man came up through the manhole at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, and he stood for a long time at the edge of the opening before he climbed out, because he had not been above ground for 43 days, and the stars were brighter than he had remembered, and he was not yet certain that the brightness was real. It was the 11th of June, 1943. The wall of the ghetto had been gone for nearly a month. The Germans had completed its demolition in the 3rd week of May, working block by block, and what remained of the perimeter was now a low, irregular line of broken brick that no longer described an enclosure. The streets that had once been inside the wall were no longer streets. The buildings that had once held 350,000 people were no longer buildings. What remained, where the ghetto had been, was a field of rubble that extended for nearly 2 square kilometers, on which the Germans had begun, in early June, to plant the first of what would eventually be many small placards declaring the area cleared. The man who emerged from the manhole did not know any of this with certainty. He had been told fragments by the others below, by the small group that remained in the sewers, by the Polish couriers who had continued, at increasing risk, to pass food and information through the grates. He had assembled, in the previous weeks, an approximate picture of the world above. The picture was incomplete. The picture would have to be revised by what he saw. The manhole opened onto a courtyard behind a tenement on the Aryan side of what had once been the wall, perhaps 40 meters west of where the gate at Naleki had stood. The courtyard was empty. A single cat was sitting on the lid of a coal bin, watching him without movement. A light burned in a window on the third floor of the building. Somewhere, a clock could be heard ticking through an open window. The man was 29 years old. His name was Joseph. He had been a fighter in a bunker on Miła Street, and his bunker had been discovered on the 3rd of May, and he had escaped through a connecting tunnel to a smaller bunker on Pabia, and that bunker had been discovered on the 7th, and he had escaped again, this time into the sewers, where he had been since. Of the original 23 people in his bunker, he was the only one above ground. He climbed out fully. He replaced the manhole cover slowly, so that the small grinding sound of metal against stone would not wake anyone. He stood in the courtyard. He listened. The city was quiet, in the way cities are quiet at 2:30 in the morning. A few distant sounds, a dog barking somewhere far to the south, the slow movement of a vehicle several blocks away, and otherwise nothing. No voices. No boots. No engines. He had been instructed by the small Polish network that had agreed, after long negotiation, to receive him. Instructed to wait in the courtyard for 15 minutes, to make sure no one was watching, and then to walk west to a particular doorway on Miła Street, where a woman would be waiting to bring him to a hidden room above a cobbler's shop. He had been given a phrase to use when she opened the door. He had memorized the phrase. He had been repeating it to himself silently in the sewer for the previous 20 hours. He stood in the courtyard. He looked up at the sky. The stars were unfamiliar. Not the constellations themselves. He recognized those vaguely from his childhood, but the quality of their light. 43 days underground had altered something in his eyes. The stars were too bright. He could not look at them for long. He looked instead at the cat, which had not moved from the lid of the coal bin. The cat looked back at him. The cat was, the man understood after a moment, the first living creature that had looked at him without intending him harm in nearly 2 months. He did not move. Neither did the cat. From the distance, very faintly, he heard something. He did not at first identify it. The sound came from the south, perhaps 3 or 4 streets away, and it was a small mechanical sound that he had not heard in a very long time, and the part of his memory that had once known the sound had fallen out of use, and it took him perhaps 4 seconds before the recognition came. It was a tram bell. Line 17 perhaps, or another. A late service, the last run of the night, the bell ringing at a corner he could not see. He did not move. He stood in the courtyard with his hands at his sides, and his face turned slightly toward the direction the sound had come from, and he listened to the silence after the bell, and the silence had a texture that he had forgotten could exist. For 2.5 years he had heard this sound from the other side of the wall, and it had been a sound that came from elsewhere, that did not belong to him, that marked the existence of a world he was forbidden from. Now it had come to him. Now he was on the side of the wall where the bell rang. Now technically, the sound was his. He did not feel that it was his. He stood in the courtyard for a long time. Longer than the 15 minutes he had been instructed to wait. The cat eventually grew tired of the situation and stood up and stretched and walked away across the cobblestones, disappearing into a passage at the far side of the courtyard. The man watched it go. He did not follow. He knew, somewhere in the part of him that was still functioning practically, that he had to walk to the doorway on Miła Street. He knew that the woman would be waiting. He knew that if he did not arrive, she would conclude that something had gone wrong, and the arrangement would not be repeated, and he would have to make his way alone in a city where, if he was discovered, he would not survive the morning. He knew all of this. He did not move. What was holding him in the courtyard was not fear exactly. It was something simpler and more difficult to name. He had spent 43 days underground, in a network of tunnels filled with cold water, and the smell of decomposition, and the small movements of others who, like him, had not yet decided whether to come up. He had imagined the surface, in those days, as a place he was working toward. Now he was on the surface. The surface was not what he had imagined. It was not because the surface was worse. The surface was, in many ways, exactly what he had remembered. A courtyard. A cat. Stars. A distant tram bell. The ordinary furniture of an ordinary night in a city he had lived in his entire life. What he had not anticipated was that the ordinary furniture would now be unbearable. That a courtyard could be a courtyard, exactly as it had been 3 years ago, while 3 streets to the east, the entire world he had known had been reduced to a field of rubble. This was a fact for which he had not prepared. The unchangedness was the difficulty. The cat was the difficulty. The bell was the difficulty. He understood now, standing in the courtyard, why some of the others below had decided not to come up. He did not understand it as a thought. He understood it as a weight in his chest that had not been there in the sewer, and that had appeared the moment he had heard the bell, and that he could not now imagine learning how to carry through a life that would be expected, by everyone he might meet, to look something like a normal life. He stood in the courtyard for several more minutes. Then, because the practical part of him eventually overcame the rest, he walked. He crossed the courtyard. He passed through the entry into the street. He walked west along the pavement, slowly, with his head slightly down, in the way that men walked at this hour in this city when they did not wish to attract attention. The street was empty. A few windows lit. The sky still very clear, the stars still very bright. At the corner of Miła, he paused. He looked east, although he knew he should not. He could not see the rubble field from this corner. The buildings on the Aryan side blocked the view, but he could see against the night sky a particular kind of darkness that he understood to be the absence of the buildings that had once been there. The darkness extended for some distance. It had no edge that he could see. He turned away from it. He walked the remaining distance to the doorway he had been told about. He raised his hand to knock. Before he knocked, he stopped. He stood with his hand raised. He listened one more time for the bell. The bell did not ring. The line had finished its service for the night. The driver was returning the tram to the depot in Zolibors, and the bell would not ring again until 5:30 in the morning, and Joseph would not, in any case, be in this courtyard to hear it. He knocked. The door opened. The woman was perhaps 50, in a dark dressing gown, with her hair tied back. She did not speak. She looked at him with an expression he could not read. He said the phrase he had memorized. She nodded once. She stepped back. She let him in. She closed the door behind him. In the courtyard he had left, the cat had returned to the lid of the coal bin. It sat there for the rest of the night. No one else came up through the manhole until the following week, and when they did, the cat watched them too, in the same way, and they too stood for some time in the courtyard before they walked toward whatever was waiting for them. Below the courtyard, in the sewers, the water continued its slow movement through the dark. Some people remained down there for weeks longer. A few remained for months. A small number, a number that has never been determined, remained until they could not remain any longer and were not seen again by anyone. The bell did not ring again that night. The city continued its sleep. The stars did not dim. What had been the ghetto remained, in the early summer of 1943, a darkness without edge, against which the lights of the surrounding streets continued, very small and very ordinary, to burn. The book of Heine's poems travelled with Yitzhak Zuckerman through the rest of the war, and through the years that followed it, and across the sea to the country that did not yet exist when Mordecai Anilevich wrote his last letter, and into the small house where Zuckerman lived, with the woman called Zivia, who had once stood at the doorway of a command room beneath the earth on Miła Street, in a kibbutz called Lohamei Hagiteo, the Ghetto Fighters, which they had founded together in 1949, and where they would remain, in different rooms of the same modest house, for the rest of their long lives. Zuckerman opened the book many times in those years. The first page he had placed inside it, the page on which he had written, on the 11th of May 1943, the fragments of Mordecai's letter as recited by the man who had survived the bunker. That page yellowed slowly, and the ink darkened slightly, and the small, careful gaps where Zuckerman had refused to fill in what the messenger could not remember remained, through every reading, the most important parts of what was on the page. He never filled them in. He published the letter eventually in his own memoir of the Uprising, a long book that took him many years to write, and which he did not complete until he was nearly 70. In the published version, the gaps appeared as ellipses, 3 dots indented in the center of the page. Some readers, over the decades, would write to him asking what had been in those gaps. He answered every letter. He told them all the same thing. He told them that he did not know. He told them that the lines had been written by a man in a bunker beneath a city that no longer existed, and that the man had died, and that the lines had been buried with him, and that what remained had been carried out by the eyes of another man for 3 seconds in low light. He told them that to invent the missing lines would be a small theft from a death that had already taken so much that it could not be permitted to take this also. He told them, in the longer letters to readers who pressed him, that he had come to understand the gaps as the truest part of what had been written. The fragments that survived were the dream sentence, the naming of self-defense, the brief farewell. What had been lost was what had been between them, the explaining, the placing, the working out of meaning that a man in his last days had been performing on a small piece of paper in the lining of his jacket. That was the part he could not have. That was the part no one would ever have. And so what reaches us now, 80 years after the spring of 1943, is what reached Zuckerman in the small room above the tailor's shop on Marzakowska Street. The dream of my life has come true. I have lived to see Jewish self-defense in the ghetto rise to its full strength. Then the silence of 3 lines that no one alive can recover. Then the words, "Be well, my friend. This is what remains. It is not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it is what is honest, and it is what survived, and it is what we are permitted to carry forward, the fragments and the gaps together, neither completed by the other, neither softened by the other." The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted 27 days. The German operation that surrounded it lasted 33. When it ended, more than 13,000 Jews had been killed inside the wall. Approximately 56,000 survivors were sent to Treblinka and Majdanek and the labor camps in the days and weeks that followed. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw, which Stroop had declared in his leather book to be no longer in existence, was, by the autumn of 1943, in fact, no longer in existence in any form that could be called a community. This is the easily told part. The harder part is what was not contained in those numbers. The watchmaker was not contained in them. He has not been named in this telling, because his name is not known. The records of the bunker on Miła Street identify many of those who died there, but not all of them, and the man who counted bullets and breaths and small observations in 3 notebooks in the kitchen chamber, the man who sealed the air shafts on the morning of the 8th of May, is among those whose name was not preserved. The notebooks were not preserved either. What he wrote in them is gone. The girl who said she preferred to wait, in the pocket of the building on Franciscanska Street, is not contained in those numbers in any way that history would recognize. Her name was not recovered. 2 of the other names from that pocket were eventually identified by historians working through the records of the local bunkers, but hers was not. She remains, in the records and in this telling, the girl who said she preferred to wait. The young messenger Aaron, buried under the leaning wall on Świętojerska, is not contained. Rachel, who stood in cold water in a tunnel beneath Pavia Street and listened to footsteps above her, is not contained. Reb Mendel, in his small synagogue at the corner of Wawinska and Miła, who sat in the dark of his prayer hall through the day the city around him fell, is not contained. None of them are. What is contained in numbers is the magnitude. What slips out is the specificity. The man tying his shoe carefully with a double knot. The woman covering the face of a child. The young man writing his name on the wall in charcoal. The mother singing softly to a child who had stopped crying, the song continuing, the singing not for the child. These are the things the numbers cannot hold. It is for these things that the archive exists. Mordecai Anilevich was 23 years old when he died. He had commanded an organization that, by any measure available to the world he was opposing, did not exist. He had held positions for 27 days that the operation against him had been allotted 3 days to clear. He had written, in his last letter, that the dream of his life had come true. The dream, in the lines that survived, was named only as Jewish self-defense in the ghetto rising to its full strength. But the lines that did not survive, the 3 lines that Zuckerman would never fill in, that the messenger could not recover, that the rubble of the bunker on Miła Street keeps for itself, those lines may have said more. They may have said what the dream had been, before it had a chance to come true. They may have placed the dream sentence in the longer thought from which it had been cut. We will not know. That is the condition of the archive. What we have is what reached us. What we honor is the gap as much as the words around it. Yosef, the man who climbed out of the manhole in June, survived the war. He lived in Warsaw for a few years afterwards. He left for Israel in 1948. He died in 1981 in a small apartment in Tel Aviv, of a heart condition he had never had treated. He left no children. He left a small box of papers, which were donated by a neighbor to the archive at Lohame Hageteo, and which contained, among other things, a brief account he had written in 1962 of his emergence from the sewer. The account was 3 pages long. It described the cat. It described the stars. It did not describe the bell. Whether he had forgotten the bell, or whether he had remembered it but had not yet found the words for what it had meant to him, or whether he had decided that the bell was not for the page. The account does not say. Each of these possibilities is its own small grief. The Polish woman in the grey coat, who stood on the pavement at Krasinski Square on the evening of the 16th of May and remembered a plum given to her at the age of 9, lived in Warsaw for the rest of her life. She died in 1971. Her name is not known to this telling. She told the story of the plum to her daughter once, on a long winter evening in the late 1950s, and the daughter told it to her own daughter many years later, and the granddaughter, an elderly woman now, lives in a flat in Warsaw, not far from where the wall of the ghetto once stood. She tells the story sometimes. She does not always know why. The grandmother who took her granddaughter to the carousel in Krasinski Square on Easter Sunday 1943 lived until 1968. She did not, in any record that survived, ever speak of the wall again, or of the smoke, or of the 4 seconds in which she paused at the edge of the square and looked at it. Her granddaughter, the girl in the blue coat, lived until 2019. She remembered, until the end of her life, the color of the carousel horses. She did not remember the smoke. Each silence in this story is its own small monument. And the tram. Line 17. The line continued to run after the war. Through the reconstruction of the city, through the long decades of the regime that followed, through the reorganization of routes in the 1990s, the bell of Line 17, or its replacement, or the replacement of the replacement, continued to ring at the corner of what had been Bonifraterska, although the street itself was rebuilt and renamed, and the wall it had once passed beside was no longer there to give the sound its terrible meaning. The driver, who had driven the route for 19 years, who had stopped looking at the wall some weeks into the spring of 1943, retired in 1957. He died in 1969, of natural causes, in a small flat in Praga. He never spoke to anyone of what he had seen and not seen during those weeks. His silence was not unusual. Most of the people in the city he passed through carried similar silences in different shapes for the rest of their lives. The tram itself was retired in 1962. A different car ran the route after that. The bell on the new car was slightly different in tone. No one in the city noticed, because no one in the city had ever listened to it carefully enough to know what it had sounded like before. This is one of the small mercies, or one of the small losses. The distinction is not always available to be made. What remains then of Warsaw 1943? What is permitted to remain? What reaches us through 80 years of distance and through the limits of every honest archive is approximately this. A wall that is no longer there. A field of rubble that has since become a neighborhood of apartment blocks built in the 1950s, on which monuments now stand, and on which, beneath the monuments, the bunkers and the bodies have not been entirely removed. A leather book in a German archive, with a sentence in pencil that is not true, and that has been quoted for 80 years as if it were. A book of Heine's poems in the archive at Lohame Hargetauert, with 2 pages folded inside it, both of them incomplete. 3 notebooks that do not exist. A name on a wall in charcoal that is no longer a wall. A song without words, sung by a mother to no child, in a chamber that is now part of the foundation of a building she would not recognize. And the fragments of a letter. The dream of my life has come true. I have lived to see Jewish self-defense in the ghetto rise to its full strength. The silence of 3 lines. Be well, my friend. The archive does not close. Stories like this one are not finished by being told. They are only carried for a while by whoever is willing to carry them, and then handed forward, in the same incomplete shape in which they were received, to whoever comes next. If you have stayed with this story to its end, then you are now part of what carries it. Not because the story needed you, because the story has always needed someone, and tonight that someone is you. If you would like to suggest the next history the archive should hold, a year, a city, a silence you have been waiting to hear, leave it in a comment. The archive is built slowly by everyone who arrives at it. This has been Warsaw, 1943. The dream sentence remains. The 3 lines remain missing. The bell rings somewhere in the city at the corner where a wall used to be. And the archive continues. History told with space to breathe.